Montana, summer 1884. The midday sun hung mercilessly over Silver Creek Station, baking the weathered wooden platform until it shimmered with heat. Dust motes danced in shafts of light that cut through gaps in the station roof, and the air was thick with the scent of hot pine and creosote. The newly arrived train hissed and steamed as if exhausted from its journey across the vast Montana prairie. Rebecca Simmons stood at the far end of the platform, her slender frame rigid with tension. One hand clutched a small, worn carpet bag that contained everything she and her son still owned in this world. The other hand held tightly to 5-year-old Matthew, who leaned against her skirts, his small face pinched with fatigue and hunger. She surveyed the small frontier town with eyes that had grown too accustomed to disappointment. Silver Creek was smaller than she'd expected, a handful of buildings strung along a single dirt road, the weathered facades bearing witness to harsh winters and unforgiving summers. It wasn't much, but it represented her last hope. "Mama, I'm thirsty," Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible above the bustle of passengers disembarking around them. Rebecca's heart clenched. She'd rationed their water during the final leg of their journey, hoping to make it last, but Matthew's canteen had been empty for hours. "I know, sweet pea. We'll find water soon." She forced brightness into her voice, even as worry gnawed at her insides. The last of her money had gone to their train tickets. There wasn't a penny left for food or lodging, but she couldn't let Matthew see her fear. At 5 years old, he already carried too much worry, and his small shoulders had seen too much disappointment in his young life. The station began to empty as passengers were greeted by waiting family members or drifted toward the town's single hotel. Rebecca remained rooted in place, unsure where to go or what to do next. Her letter inquiring about work at the general store had gone unanswered. She had arrived with nothing but hope and determination, neither of which would fill Matthew's empty stomach. A distant sound made her stiffen. Shouts echoed from the far end of the platform, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Rebecca instinctively pulled Matthew close, scanning for danger. 3 men in dusty clothes and bandanas had emerged from behind the station house. Their guns were drawn, faces partially concealed. "Nobody move!" the tallest one bellowed, firing a warning shot into the air that sent screams rippling through the crowd. "This is a robbery!" Chaos erupted. Passengers scattered in panic, pushing and shoving toward exits. The bandits moved with practiced efficiency, forcing the station master against a wall while relieving terrified travelers of their valuables. Rebecca backed away, keeping Matthew shielded behind her skirts as they edged toward the far corner of the platform. There was nowhere to run. The open prairie stretched endlessly behind the station, offering no cover or escape. The crowd surged in fear as more shots rang out. Rebecca felt herself being pushed toward the edge of the platform. She stumbled, losing her grip on Matthew's hand. Panic shot through her as they were separated by the desperate crowd. "Matthew!" Her scream was lost in the cacophony of shouts and gunfire. A bullet splintered the wooden post beside her head. Rebecca ducked instinctively, desperately searching for her son in the sea of churning bodies. She caught a glimpse of his small form being pushed dangerously close to the edge of the platform. "Matthew!" she screamed again, fighting against the tide of bodies. The boy turned at her, his eyes wide with terror, and then time seemed to slow as he lost his balance, arms windmilling as he began to fall backward toward the tracks below. A blur of movement caught her eye. A tall man in a worn leather vest lunged through the crowd, one arm shooting out to grab Matthew before he could fall. With a single fluid motion, he pulled the boy to safety and reached for Rebecca with his free hand. "This way," the stranger shouted above the din, his voice deep and commanding. "Stay low." Rebecca grasped his outstretched hand without hesitation. His fingers were calloused but strong, closing firmly around hers as he guided them beneath the platform and into the shadows beneath the station. Matthew clung to the man's other arm, his small body trembling. They crouched in darkness, smelling of dust and oil, the chaos above continuing as boots thundered across the platform boards. Rebecca held Matthew close, feeling his heart racing against her chest. Their rescuer remained perfectly still, one hand resting protectively on Matthew's shoulder as he listened to the commotion above. He was a study in weathered angles, tall and broad-shouldered, with lines etched deeply around eyes that seemed to have witnessed more than their fair share of hardship. Salt and pepper hair curled at his collar, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He wore the practical clothes of a rancher, a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, a leather vest worn smooth with age, and denim pants tucked into scuffed boots. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice pitched low, as he examined Matthew with a quick assessing glance. Rebecca shook her head, still breathless with fear. "No thanks to you. If you hadn't caught him—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the horrible possibilities too vivid in her mind. "Sheriff's deputies will be here soon," the man said, his attention shifting to the platform above as the sounds of gunfire grew more distant. "The bandits are most likely heading for the tree line past the livery. They hit the same time as the noon train every few months." "You've seen this before?" Rebecca asked, keeping her voice low as she stroked Matthew's hair. The man's mouth tightened. "Silver Creek's growing. Where there's money, there's trouble." He glanced at them again, his eyes softening as they fell on Matthew. "First time in town?" "Yes," Rebecca answered suddenly, conscious of her dusty traveling dress and the threadbare carpet bag that revealed their desperate circumstances more clearly than any words. The man nodded but asked no further questions. He listened intently to the sounds above until the platform fell into an uneasy quiet punctuated only by distant shouts as the sheriff's men gave chase. "I think it's safe now," he said, shifting to peer out from their hiding place. "They're gone." He helped them out from beneath the platform, his movements careful and unhurried. Once they were standing in the open air again, Rebecca expected him to take his leave. Their brief connection formed and broken in a moment of crisis, but he hesitated, studying her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said into the awkward silence. "You saved my son's life." The man inclined his head slightly. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. In the chaos, dozens had pushed past Matthew without a second glance. Before Rebecca could respond, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd that had begun to reform on the platform as the danger passed. She watched him go, struck by the strange sense that something significant had just occurred, though she couldn't have explained why. "Mama," Matthew tugged at her skirt, his voice small, "I'm still thirsty." The simple request pulled her back to their immediate reality. They were alone in a strange town with no money, no connections, and no plan beyond survival. The momentary drama of the robbery had only delayed the inevitable confrontation with their desperate circumstances. Rebecca surveyed the now quieting platform. Most passengers had departed, leaving only a few stragglers and the harried station master attempting to restore order. She led Matthew to a bench in the shade, setting down their meager belongings. "Wait here with our things," she instructed, smoothing his dark hair. "I'm going to see if there's a water pump." She found one at the side of the station, a rusted iron contraption that yielded a trickle of lukewarm water after considerable effort. Rebecca soaked her handkerchief, wringing it out over Matthew's parched lips before refilling their empty canteen. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. By the time she returned, the platform had nearly emptied. The afternoon stretched before them with no destination in sight. Rebecca sat beside Matthew, arm around his thin shoulders, and tried to project a confidence she didn't feel. "What do we do now, Mama?" Matthew asked, leaning against her side. "We'll find work," she answered, the same response she'd given in every town they'd passed through since William's death. "Things will be better here." The words had become a prayer as much as a promise. They sat in silence as the minutes ticked by, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. Rebecca was contemplating whether to approach the station master about work in town when she felt a strange prickling sensation, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She looked up to find a small girl standing before them, no more than 4 years old, with wheat blonde braids and eyes so vividly blue they seemed to reflect the vast Montana sky. The child wore a clean gingham dress with a white pinafore, her small boots polished to a shine. She looked utterly out of place in the dusty, heat-soaked station, like a porcelain doll set down in the wilderness. The girl stared at them with unnerving directness, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. Then, to Rebecca's astonishment, she stepped forward and addressed Matthew by name. "You're hungry, Matthew," she stated simply, "and thirsty too, even though you just had water." Rebecca stiffened instinctively, pulling Matthew closer. "How do you know my son's name?" she demanded, scanning the platform for the child's guardians. The little girl seemed untroubled by Rebecca's alarm. "I just know things sometimes," she replied with the matter-of-fact acceptance unique to very young children. She pointed at Rebecca. "You're hungry too. You haven't eaten since yesterday morning." The accuracy of the statement sent a chill down Rebecca's spine despite the oppressive heat. Emily, a man's voice called from across the platform. Emily, where have you wandered off to? Rebecca looked up to see their rescuer from earlier striding toward them, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. The girl Emily turned toward him with a smile that transformed her solemn face. Papa, I found them, she announced triumphantly, just like I said we would. The man's steps faltered for just a moment, something flickering in his eyes before his expression smoothed into careful neutrality. He reached them and placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. I apologize if Emily bothered you, he said, his gaze meeting Rebecca's. She sometimes says things without thinking. Rebecca rose to her feet, keeping Matthew close. She knew my son's name, she said quietly, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. How would she know that? The man hesitated, a shadow crossing his weathered features. Emily has a gift. She knows things, sometimes things she couldn't possibly know. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the explanation. My name is Everett Sullivan. I believe I neglected to introduce myself earlier. Rebecca didn't offer her own name in return, her wariness evident. Everett seemed to understand her hesitation. Emily, he said gently, did you introduce yourself properly before you started announcing things about these folks? The little girl looked down at her boots, abashed. No, Papa. She looked up at Rebecca and Matthew, her clear blue eyes solemn. I'm Emily Sullivan. I'm 4 years old and we have a ranch outside of town. She pointed at Matthew. He's 5, but he'll be 6 in September. Rebecca inhaled sharply. The girl couldn't possibly know Matthew's birthday. Everett's expression tightened. Emily, what did we discuss about telling strangers things about themselves? That it frightens them, Emily recited dutifully. That I should say hello first and let you do the talking. She looked up at Rebecca with genuine contrition. I'm sorry I scared you, but you looked so sweaty and hungry, and Matthew too. There was something in the child's direct gaze that made it impossible for Rebecca to maintain her anger. Despite the strangeness of the encounter, she found herself answering. I'm Rebecca Simmons. This is my son Matthew. She hesitated, then added, and yes, he will be 6 in September. Everett studied her for a long moment, then glanced at their solitary carpetbag and Matthew's worn shoes. He seemed to come to a decision. Mrs. Simmons, do you have arrangements in town? The formal address reminded Rebecca of her status, a widow in a strange place with no connections and no resources. She lifted her chin, pride warring with practicality. Not yet, she admitted. I had hoped there might be work at the general store. Elijah Davis runs the general store, Everett replied. Good man, but he's not hiring at present. He paused, choosing his words with care. My ranch is short-handed since my foreman took ill last month. I could use help with the household cooking, cleaning, looking after Emily. He nodded toward Matthew. Your boy would be welcome too, of course. Rebecca stiffened. She'd heard such offers before in other towns, seemingly kind gestures that came with unspoken expectations. A widow with a child was vulnerable, and too many men saw that vulnerability as an opportunity. As if reading her thoughts, Everett added quietly, you'd have the cabin to yourself. It's small but clean, separate from the main house. Regular meals, fair wages. You'd be doing me a service, Mrs. Simmons. Emily's been without a woman's influence since her mother passed. Before Rebecca could respond, Emily tugged at her father's hand and whispered something in his ear. Everett's expression shifted subtly, a flash of something like recognition crossing his features before he carefully composed himself. Is something wrong? Rebecca asked, noting the change. No, Everett replied, perhaps too quickly. Emily was just reminding me about dinner. He cleared his throat. The offer stands, Mrs. Simmons. No obligation beyond honest work. If it doesn't suit you, I'll drive you back to town whenever you wish. Rebecca hesitated, weighing their limited options. She had exactly 27 cents in her pocket, not enough for a night's lodging, let alone food. Matthew was exhausted and hungry. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. I accept, she said finally. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Relief flickered across Everett's face. Our wagon's just outside the station. Do you need help with your things? Rebecca clutched her single carpet bag, all that remained of their former life. This is everything. Something in Everett's eyes softened at the quiet dignity in her voice. He nodded once, then turned toward the station exit, Emily skipping ahead of him. As they followed, Matthew tugged at Rebecca's hand. Mama, he whispered, looking up at her with serious eyes. How did she know when my birthday is? Rebecca had no answer, only a growing sense that she had stepped into something more complex than a simple offer of employment. She squeezed Matthew's hand reassuringly, though doubt gnawed at her insides. Some people are just good at guessing, she murmured, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they rang hollow. Outside the station, the afternoon heat shimmered over the dusty main street. Everett's wagon stood waiting, a sturdy farm vehicle pulled by two patient draft horses. He helped Rebecca and Matthew up onto the wooden bench seat, then lifted Emily beside them before taking the reins. As they pulled away from Silver Creek Station, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed an invisible threshold. Behind them lay the ruins of their former life. Ahead stretched an unknown future on a stranger's ranch. She told herself it was simple practicality that had led her to accept Everett's offer, shelter and food for her son, but deep inside, something else whispered that larger forces were at work. She caught Everett glancing at her, his expression inscrutable, before he turned his attention back to the road. Beside her, Matthew had already begun to doze, exhaustion finally claiming him as the wagon rocked gently along the rutted dirt road. Emily sat quietly, her small fingers plaiting and unplaiting the end of one blonde braid. The town of Silver Creek fell away behind them as they journeyed eastward. The road wound through rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers, their bright heads nodding in the afternoon breeze. In the distance, the jagged peaks of mountains cut a sharp line against the brilliant blue sky. It's about 5 miles to the ranch, Everett said, breaking the silence. The cabin I mentioned, it's not fancy, but it's weather-tight. There's a stove, a proper bed, even some books left by the previous occupant. That's more than generous, Rebecca replied carefully, not wanting to seem ungrateful while still maintaining the formalities she felt necessary with the stranger. May I ask what happened to your previous housekeeper? A shadow crossed Everett's face. Mrs. Holloway returned to her family in Oregon when her daughter took ill. She'd been with us since... He paused, then continued more quietly, since my wife passed 3 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss, Rebecca said automatically, the words familiar on her tongue, after speaking them so many times following William's death. Everett nodded once in acknowledgement but offered no further details. Instead, he asked, have you worked as a housekeeper before Mrs. Simmons? Rebecca straightened her spine. I can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household, Mr. Sullivan. I tended my own home before my husband died, and I've taken whatever honest work I could find since then. I didn't mean to question your capabilities, Everett said, his tone softening, only to understand what you're accustomed to. Rebecca relaxed slightly, recognizing that his question hadn't been meant to offend. Before we married, I worked as a nursemaid for a doctor's family in St. Louis. I know how to care for children and run a proper household. Everett nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. Emily's a good child, but she's different from other children her age. She doesn't have many playmates. Because of her gift? Rebecca asked quietly, glancing at the little girl, who appeared to be lost in her own thoughts. Everett's hands tightened on the reins. Some folks in town are superstitious. They find Emily unsettling. His jaw tightened. They're wrong about her. She's just a child who sometimes knows things she shouldn't. Like my son's birthday, Rebecca murmured. Yes, Everett sighed. Like that. I don't understand it myself. Her mother was the same way, could sometimes sense things about people, know when something was about to happen. He glanced at his daughter with an expression of mingled pride and concern. It's not something we discuss outside the family. Rebecca absorbed this, wondering what kind of household she was entering. She had heard stories of seers and people with the sight back in Missouri, though she'd always dismissed such tales as superstition. Yet there was no denying that Emily had known things about Matthew she couldn't possibly have learned through ordinary means. I won't judge your daughter, Mr. Sullivan, she said finally. Children come with all manner of gifts and challenges. Everett gave her a look of genuine gratitude. Thank you, Mrs. Simmons. That's more understanding than most show. They fell into silence again as the wagon continued its steady progress through the vast prairie landscape. The immensity of the open space was both breathtaking and intimidating to Rebecca, who had grown up in the more confined landscapes of Missouri. Here the land stretched endlessly in all directions, the grass rippling like water under the touch of the wind. After about an hour of travel, Everett guided the wagon up a gentle rise. At the crest, he drew the horses to a halt. Just wanted you to see this, he said quietly. The view from the hilltop was spectacular. The prairie spread out below them, a sea of golden grass interspersed with patches of wildflowers. In the distance, a creek wound like a silver ribbon through the landscape bordered by a line of cottonwood trees. And there, nestled in a natural depression, where the creek widened into a small pond, stood the Sullivan Ranch. It was larger than Rebecca had expected, a substantial two-story house of weathered wood with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn, what appeared to be a bunkhouse, a chicken coop, and a few smaller structures. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling grassland. Smoke rose in a thin line from the chimney of the main house, a sign of habitation in the vastness of the prairie. Matthew, who had awakened as the wagon stopped, stared wide-eyed at the panorama before them. It was perhaps the first truly beautiful sight he'd seen since his father's death, and Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat at the wonder in his expression. "That's your home?" he asked, his voice small with awe. "That's our home," Emily corrected him matter-of-factly. "You're going to live there too now." The simple declaration hung in the air, neither Everett nor Rebecca contradicting it, though both knew their arrangement was temporary, an exchange of labor for shelter, nothing more. Emily's certainty made Rebecca uneasy, but the practicalities of their situation left no room for doubt. This was their best hope, at least for now. As Everett urged the horses forward again, Rebecca caught Matthew's eye and offered him a reassuring smile. Whatever strange circumstances had brought them here, they were together. That was what mattered most. The wagon descended the hill and continued along the winding road toward the ranch. As they drew closer, Rebecca could see more details: the neat vegetable garden beside the house, chickens scratching in the yard, a wooden swing hanging from the branch of an ancient cottonwood tree. It looked like a place where a family might be happy, and the thought brought a bittersweet ache to her chest. How long had it been since she'd allowed herself to think in terms of happiness rather than mere survival? Since William's death, each day had been an exercise in endurance, finding enough food, a safe place to sleep, work that would sustain them without separating her from Matthew. The constant struggle had left little room for joy. Everett guided the wagon into the ranch yard and brought the horses to a stop before the main house. A man emerged from the barn, tall and lanky, with skin darkened by the sun, wearing the practical clothes of a ranch hand. "That's Charlie Baker," Everett explained as he set the brake. "He helps with the livestock. His wife Mabel comes in twice a week to help with laundry and preserving." Rebecca nodded, taking note of this information as Everett climbed down from the wagon. He lifted Emily to the ground, then extended a hand to assist Rebecca and Matthew. "Charlie," he called, "this is Mrs. Simmons and her son Matthew. They'll be staying in the old foreman's cabin. Mrs. Simmons will be helping with the house and looking after Emily." Charlie touched his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, young sir," he said with a nod to Matthew. "Pleased to make your acquaintance." Rebecca returned the greeting, noting the man's open, honest face and the lack of curiosity in his manner. He accepted their presence without question, as if new arrivals at the isolated ranch were commonplace. "Charlie, would you mind seeing to the team?" Everett asked. "I'll show Mrs. Simmons and her son to their quarters." "Of course, boss." Charlie took the horse's reins and led the team toward the barn, whistling softly as he went. Everett turned to Rebecca. "The cabin's just behind the main house. We can go through the kitchen garden. It's the quickest way." He led them along a well-trodden path that wound past a thriving vegetable garden enclosed by a low wooden fence. Rebecca noted the neat rows of corn, beans, carrots, and potatoes with approval. The garden spoke of careful tending and planning. Someone here understood the practical necessities of feeding a household. Beyond the garden stood a small cabin, its weathered boards silvered by years of sun and wind. A covered porch ran along the front, furnished with a simple wooden rocker. Smoke curled from a stone chimney at one end, suggesting that someone had anticipated their arrival by lighting a fire against the evening chill that would follow the day's heat. "Mabel must have come by to air it out," Everett commented as they approached. "She does that without being asked, has a sense for when things need doing." He stepped onto the porch and opened the door, standing aside to let Rebecca enter first. She hesitated only briefly before crossing the threshold, Matthew's hand firmly in hers. The interior was simple but clean and surprisingly welcoming. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a cast-iron stove against one wall, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, and a small settee positioned near the hearth. Shelves held an assortment of dishes and cooking utensils all neatly arranged. A door at the back presumably led to the bedroom. There's a pump just outside for water, Everett explained, and the necessaries behind the cabin. Firewood stacked on the back porch. The bedroom has a proper bed for you, and there's a trundle that pulls out for Matthew. Rebecca moved further into the room, taking in the simple comforts it offered. After months of boarding houses and makeshift accommodations, the small cabin seemed luxurious in its privacy and self-containment. "It's more than adequate, Mr. Sullivan, thank you." Everett nodded, seeming relieved by her approval. "There's food in the pantry, bread preserves, dried beans, coffee, tea. Mabel's left a stew simmering on the stove for your supper." He hesitated, then added, "We usually take breakfast at 7 and supper at 6 in the main house. Midday meal is informal whenever work allows. You are welcome to join us or eat here if you prefer." "I'll be ready to begin work in the morning," Rebecca assured him, wanting to establish from the outset that she understood the nature of their arrangement. "Take tomorrow to settle in," Everett countered. "There's no rush." Emily, who had been remarkably quiet during the tour of the cabin, suddenly spoke up. "Mama's blue dress is in the trunk under the bed," she announced. "The one with the lace collar. It needs mending, but it's still pretty." A heavy silence fell over the room. Rebecca stared at the child, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of the day. She had packed her one good dress of blue cotton with a lace collar at the bottom of the carpet bag wrapped in tissue paper. It had been William's favorite, and she had preserved it even as they were forced to sell most of their possessions. Everett's face tightened. "Emily," he said, his voice strained, "why don't you run to the house and ask Charlie to bring Mrs. Simmons's bag from the wagon?" Emily looked confused. "But I was just—" "Now please," Everett interrupted firmly. The little girl sighed but obeyed, skipping out the door and across the garden toward the main house. When she was gone, Everett turned to Rebecca, his expression troubled. "I apologize for Emily's comments. As I mentioned, she sometimes knows things she couldn't possibly know." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "We don't understand it ourselves. Her mother was the same way." Rebecca glanced at Matthew, who was exploring the cabin with the curiosity of a child too young to fully grasp the strangeness of their situation. "It's unsettling," she admitted quietly, "but she's a child. She doesn't mean any harm." "No, she doesn't," Everett agreed, his expression softening as he watched Matthew examining the books on a small shelf. "She's lonely, I think. There aren't many children her age nearby, and those in town." He trailed off, but Rebecca understood the implication. Emily's unusual perceptions had isolated her. "Matthew could use a friend as well," Rebecca said after a moment. The words were an olive branch of sorts, an acknowledgement that despite the strangeness of their beginning, they might find common ground in the needs of their children. Everett's smile was brief but genuine. "I think they'll be good for each other." He moved toward the door. "I'll leave you to settle in. If you need anything, don't hesitate to come to the main house." Rebecca nodded, suddenly eager for a moment of privacy to collect her thoughts and process the whirlwind of events that had brought them to this place. "Mr. Sullivan," she called as he reached the door. "Thank you for everything." He paused, turning back with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It's nothing more than anyone would do," he said, echoing his words from their first encounter at the station. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Rebecca sank onto the settee, the accumulated exhaustion of their journey suddenly overwhelming. Matthew climbed up beside her, his small body warm against her side. "Are we going to stay here, Mama?" he asked, his voice quiet but hopeful. Rebecca stroked his dark hair so like his father's. "For a while at least," she answered truthfully, "until we find something more permanent." Matthew nodded, accepting her answer with the resignation of a child who had learned early that nothing in life was certain. "I like it here," he said simply, "and I like Emily even if she's strange." Rebecca smiled despite herself. "Yes, she is rather strange, isn't she? But nice, I think." They sat in companionable silence until Emily returned carrying Rebecca's carpet bag with both hands. Charlie followed behind her, bearing a covered basket. "Mabel sent this over," Charlie explained, setting the basket on the table. "Said you might need more than just the stew, what with having a growing boy and all." His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled at Matthew. "My wife's got a soft spot for youngsters. Never could have enough of them herself." "Please thank her for us, Rebecca said, touched by the thoughtfulness of people who were until today complete strangers. Charlie nodded and took his leave, pausing only to ruffle Emily's blonde hair affectionately as he passed. The little girl beamed at him, then turned her attention to Matthew. "Do you want to see the kittens in the barn?" she asked. "There are 5 of them, all different colors. Mama Cat lets me hold them if I'm very gentle." Matthew looked to Rebecca for permission, his eyes bright with interest, the first genuine enthusiasm she'd seen from him in months. "You may go," she said, "but stay where Charlie can see you and come back before supper time." The children needed no further encouragement, darting out the door and across the yard toward the barn, their earlier wariness forgotten in the universal excitement of kittens. Alone at last, Rebecca allowed herself a moment of weakness. She closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging with the weight of uncertainty and fear she'd been carrying for so long. What was she doing here in a stranger's home with a child who seemed to see into her very thoughts? Had desperation clouded her judgment? With an effort, she pushed these doubts aside. They had food, shelter, and the promise of honest work. Matthew was already happier than she'd seen him in months. Whatever strangeness surrounded the Sullivan household, it offered more security than they'd known since William's death. Rebecca moved to unpack their meager belongings, starting with the blue dress Emily had mentioned. As she lifted it from the carpet bag, smoothing the wrinkles from the faded cotton, she couldn't help but wonder how the child had known about it. Was it truly some inexplicable gift as Everett claimed? Or was there a more mundane explanation? Perhaps they had been observed more closely than she realized. The thought made her uneasy, but she pushed it aside as she continued unpacking. The practical tasks of settling in left little room for speculation about things beyond her understanding. By the time she had arranged their few possessions and explored the cabin more thoroughly, the afternoon was waning. Through the window, she could see Matthew and Emily in the barnyard watching as Charlie led a horse into the corral. The sight of her son laughing as the horse nuzzled his outstretched hand brought tears to her eyes. How long had it been since she'd heard that sound? Rebecca busied herself preparing their supper, finding the promised stew simmering gently on the back of the stove. Mabel's basket yielded fresh bread butter, a jar of preserves, and even a small cake. It was more abundance than they'd seen in months, and Rebecca sent up a silent prayer of gratitude as she set the table. As dusk began to fall, she called Matthew in from his play. He arrived flushed and happy, full of stories about the kittens, the horses, and Emily's remarkable knowledge of every animal on the ranch. "She knows all their names, Mama," he reported as he washed his hands at the basin. "Even the chickens have names. And she said, 'Daisy, that's the spotted cow is going to have a calf soon, but no one else knows yet.'" Rebecca paused in slicing the bread. Did she indeed, and how would Emily know that before anyone else? Matthew shrugged, accepting the child's patience without question. "She just knows things. She said her mama taught her how to listen with more than her ears." He dried his hands on the towel Rebecca offered. "Is that possible, Mama? To hear things without your ears?" Rebecca considered her answer carefully. "Some people are more observant than others," she said finally. "They notice small details that most of us miss." It was a rational explanation and one she wanted to believe. But even as she spoke, she remembered the certainty in Emily's voice when she'd mentioned the blue dress, a detail no amount of observation could have revealed. They sat down to their meal, Rebecca marveling at the simple pleasure of dining at their own table in their own space without the curious or pitying glances of strangers. Matthew ate with hearty appetite the stew and fresh bread, disappearing quickly from his plate. After supper, she heated water for Matthew's bath in the small tin tub, then read to him from one of the books they'd found on the shelf, a collection of children's stories that had obviously been well loved, its pages soft with handling. Matthew fell asleep almost immediately after his bath, the exhaustion of their journey and the excitement of the day's events finally catching up with him. Rebecca tucked him into the trundle bed, brushing the dark hair from his forehead with a tender touch. "Sleep well, my brave boy," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his temple. Alone in the quiet cabin, Rebecca allowed herself to truly relax for the first time in months. She poured a cup of tea and carried it to the small porch, settling into the wooden rocker to watch the last light fade from the sky. The vastness of the prairie was even more apparent at dusk. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, the tall grass silvered by the rising moon moving in waves with each breath of evening wind. Stars appeared one by one, more numerous and brilliant than she'd ever seen in the city. In the distance, a coyote called the sound lonely and wild. An answering call came from farther away, a reminder that even in this emptiness, no creature was truly alone. Rebecca sipped her tea, allowing the peace of the moment to wash over her. Whatever tomorrow might bring tonight, they were safe fed and sheltered. It was more than they'd had in a very long time. The light in the main house's window caught her attention, a warm golden glow against the gathering darkness. She could just make out the silhouette of a man standing at the window looking out toward the cabin. Everett keeping watch perhaps, or lost in his own thoughts as she was in hers. There was something in his solitary vigil that touched her. They were strangers bound by circumstance, each carrying burdens the other couldn't fully understand. Yet in this moment, separated by distance but united in their solitude, Rebecca felt a curious connection to the taciturn rancher. She finished her tea and rose to go inside but paused for one last look at the starlit prairie. Despite the strangeness of the day's events and the uncertainty of their future, she couldn't deny the feeling that had settled over her, a tentative sense that perhaps against all odds they had found a place where they might belong. With that comforting thought, Rebecca entered the cabin and closed the door behind her, ready at last for the deep, dreamless sleep that had eluded her for so long. The next morning dawned clear and bright sunlight streaming through the cabin's east-facing windows. Rebecca woke feeling more rested than she had in months, the simple luxury of a proper bed and the security of a locked door having granted her the first untroubled sleep since William's death. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Matthew, and stoked the fire in the stove. The familiar routine of morning heating water for washing, preparing a simple breakfast, tidying the already neat space brought a sense of normalcy that had been missing from their nomadic existence. As she worked, Rebecca's thoughts turned to their peculiar circumstances. Everett Sullivan remained an enigma, a solitary rancher raising a strange gifted child in this remote corner of Montana. His generosity seemed genuine, but experience had taught Rebecca to be wary of kindness that came too easily. Men had ulterior motives, especially when dealing with a widow and her young son. Yet there had been nothing in Everett's manner to suggest impropriety. He'd given them privacy and independence, asking nothing beyond the work he had offered to pay her for. Perhaps, like her, he was simply a parent doing his best in difficult circumstances. Matthew woke as she was setting the table, rubbing sleep from his eyes with small fists. "Good morning, sweet pea," she greeted him, smoothing his tousled hair. "Did you sleep well?" He nodded, still drowsy. "I dreamed about Papa," he said, his voice soft. He was smiling. Rebecca's heart clenched. Matthew rarely spoke of William anymore, as if mentioning his father might somehow make the loss more real. "That's a lovely dream," she managed, turning away to hide the sudden tears that threatened. After breakfast, Rebecca decided to explore their surroundings more thoroughly. Hand in hand, she and Matthew walked the perimeter of the ranch buildings, taking note of the vegetable garden, the chicken coop, the smokehouse, and the small orchard of apple trees behind the main house. The Sullivan home was larger than she'd first thought, a substantial two-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. It spoke of prosperity and permanence, qualities Rebecca had almost forgotten in their months of transience. As they rounded the corner of the house, they came upon Everett, splitting logs near the woodpile. He worked with the efficient rhythm of a man accustomed to physical labor, his movements precise and powerful. Sweat darkened his shirt between his shoulder blades despite the early hour. He paused when he saw them, setting down his axe and wiping his brow with a bandana pulled from his pocket. "Good morning," he called. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Rebecca replied, conscious of maintaining a proper distance. "The cabin is most comfortable." Everett nodded, seeming pleased. "Glad to hear it. Emily's been up since dawn waiting for Matthew to wake. She's in the kitchen with Mabel if he'd like to join her." Matthew looked up at Rebecca, his expression hopeful. She hesitated only briefly before nodding her permission. "You may go, but mind your manners with Mrs. Baker." He needed no further encouragement, darting up the porch steps and into the house with the eagerness of a child who had been too long without companions his own age. Left alone with Everett, Rebecca felt a moment of awkwardness. The easy conversation of the previous day seemed harder to recapture in the bright light of morning. "I hope Emily's comments yesterday didn't disturb you too much," Everett said after a moment, breaking the silence. Rebecca considered her answer carefully. "It was unexpected," she admitted. "I've never encountered a child with such perceptions." Everett's expression tightened. "Clara, my wife, was the same way. She called it listening with the heart instead of the ears. Said it ran in her family." He picked up the axe again, running his thumb along the edge, as if testing its sharpness. People in town didn't understand. They called her things I won't repeat in front of a lady, which Rebecca supplied quietly, or something similar, I imagine. Everett looked up sharply, surprise evident in his face. Yes, among other things. He set the axe down again, his movements deliberate. Clara wasn't bothered by their talk. She said people fear what they don't understand, and fear makes them cruel. A shadow crossed his features. Emily doesn't have her mother's confidence yet. The things people say, they hurt her. Rebecca felt a surge of sympathy for the solemn little girl with her two knowing eyes. Children can be unkind without meaning to be, she said. Matthew has had his share of difficult encounters since his father died. Other children sense difference, even if they can't name it. Everett studied her face, seeming to find something there that satisfied him. Emily likes your boy, says he has a quiet mind, whatever that means. He smiled briefly. It's the first time she's shown real interest in another child since... He trailed off, but Rebecca understood what went unsaid, since her mother died. Matthew seems quite taken with her as well, Rebecca acknowledged. He's been too long without friends his age. Everett nodded, then changed the subject with what seemed like deliberate casualness. What brings you to Silver Creek, Mrs. Simmons? It's not exactly on the main route west. The question was reasonable enough, but Rebecca felt herself tense. She'd told the same carefully edited version of their story in a dozen towns across 3 states, but something in Everett's direct gaze made her hesitate to repeat the practiced half-truths. My husband died in a mining accident last year, she said, finally sticking to the essential facts. The company claimed no responsibility. There were debts. She looked away, the familiar shame rising despite her efforts to suppress it. We lost everything. I've been trying to find work, a place to settle, but it's been difficult with Matthew. Everett's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in his eyes at the mention of the mining accident. I'm sorry for your loss, he said simply. It's not easy raising a child alone. The shared understanding in his voice touched something in Rebecca. For a moment, they were not employer and employee, not strangers bound by circumstance, but simply two parents navigating the challenges of raising children in the shadow of loss. The moment was broken by the sound of childish laughter from the direction of the house. They both turned to see Matthew and Emily emerge onto the porch, each carrying what appeared to be a biscuit dripping with honey. Mabel's spoiling them already. Everett observed, his tone fond rather than critical. Rebecca watched as the children descended the steps and headed toward the barn, deep in conversation. It's good to see him laugh, she said softly, almost to herself. Everett followed her gaze. Emily, too. She's too serious most days. He hesitated, then added, Mrs. Simmons, I want you to know that you and Matthew are welcome here for as long as you wish to stay. There's no hurry for you to move on unless that's what you want. The generosity of the offer startled Rebecca. That's very kind, Mr. Sullivan, but I wouldn't want to impose beyond our agreement. It's not an imposition, he assured her. Good help is hard to find out here, and Emily needs... He paused, searching for the right words. She needs someone who won't judge her for being different. Before Rebecca could respond, Charlie Baker approached from the direction of the corral, his expression concerned. Boss, he called, telegraph boy just rode out from town. There's trouble at the north pasture. Blake and his men are back measuring for fence posts on our side of the boundary. Everett's face hardened, the warmth of moments before replaced by cold anger. Did they bring the survey maps this time? Not that Jenkins could see, Charlie replied. Just the same as before, acting like they own the land because the railroad says they do. Rebecca watched the exchange with growing confusion. Clearly there was more happening at the Sullivan Ranch than she had been told. Everett turned to her, his expression apologetic. I need to deal with this. Make yourself at home, Mrs. Simmons. Mabel's in the kitchen if you need anything. He strode toward the barn without waiting for a response, Charlie following close behind. Rebecca stood alone beside the woodpile, the echo of their conversation playing in her mind. Railroad disputes were common enough in the West, but there had been something in Everett's reaction, a tension beyond simple territorial concern, that piqued her curiosity. She walked slowly back toward the cabin, her mind turning over this new piece of information. The peaceful ranch she had observed yesterday apparently had troubles of its own. Whether those troubles would affect her and Matthew remained to be seen, but Rebecca had learned to be wary of complications. They had a way of becoming dangerous, especially for those with nowhere else to go. Back in the cabin, she busied herself with domestic tasks, trying to push aside her concerns. She had barely begun to sweep the floor when a knock at the door interrupted her. Opening it, she found a plump, cheerful-looking woman of about 50 standing on the porch, a basket over one arm. "You must be Mrs. Simmons," the woman said warmly. "I'm Mabel Baker, Charlie's wife. Thought I'd come see if you needed anything." Her kind eyes took in Rebecca's simple dress in the cabin beyond. "Mr. Sullivan says you're to have whatever you need from the main house stores." "That's very generous," Rebecca replied, stepping back to invite the older woman in. "Please come in. I was just getting acquainted with the cabin." Mabel entered, setting her basket on the table. "Brought you some fresh eggs and a jar of my wild plum preserves. The children are having such a fine time with the kittens, I thought I'd let them be for a while." "Thank you," Rebecca said, genuinely touched by the woman's kindness. "Matthew hasn't had much opportunity for play these past months." Mabel's expression softened with understanding. "Mr. Sullivan mentioned you've had a difficult time. Lost your husband," he said. Rebecca nodded, the familiar ache rising in her chest at the mention of William. "A year ago, a mining accident." "I'm sorry, dear. That's a heavy burden for one so young." Mabel shook her head sympathetically. "And a boy needs his father. It's not right what these companies do, sending men down into those death traps without proper safety measures." The genuine compassion in the older woman's voice loosened something in Rebecca's carefully maintained composure. "It's been challenging," she admitted more honestly than she had intended. "Finding work, keeping Matthew with me. Most places don't want to hire a woman with a child in tow." Mabel's eyes were kind but shrewd. "You've landed on your feet here, I'd say. Mr. Sullivan's a good man, fair employer. And that little girl of his needs a woman's influence, something fierce." She began unpacking her basket, revealing a loaf of freshly baked bread along with the promised eggs and preserves. "Been trying to get him to consider remarrying, but he won't hear of it. Says Emily's all he needs." Rebecca accepted the gifts with murmured thanks, uncertain how to respond to such candid commentary on her employer's personal life. Mabel seemed to sense her discomfort. "Don't mind my chatter," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Charlie says I talk enough for both of us. Just wanted you to know you're welcome here. Not everyone gets such a warm reception from Mr. Sullivan." The comment piqued Rebecca's curiosity despite her resolve to maintain professional distance. "I got the impression he doesn't often hire new staff." "Not since Mrs. Holloway left last spring," Mabel confirmed. "Been managing on his own, stubborn as he is. But with Emily getting older and him dealing with this railroad business." She trailed off, then looked at Rebecca with sudden intensity. "You be careful about that, by the way. The railroad men. They come around sometimes asking questions, making trouble. Best to stay clear of them." Rebecca's unease returned. "What sort of trouble?" Mabel glanced toward the door as if checking they were truly alone, then lowered her voice. "There's disputed land north pasture mostly. Railroad claims it's theirs by some survey or other, but it's been Sullivan land since Mr. Sullivan's father homesteaded here 30 years ago." She shook her head. "They want it for the new spur lines to the mines. Mr. Sullivan won't sell, so they're trying other ways to get it." "What ways?" Rebecca asked, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of the day. "Intimidation, mostly. Threats. Last winter someone shot 2 of his best horses. No proof it was them, but—" Mabel's expression was grim. "Charlie thinks they're trying to run him off the land, make it not worth fighting for." Rebecca absorbed this information with growing concern. She had fled one dangerous situation only to find herself potentially in the midst of another. "Does Mr. Sullivan have legal claim to the land?" "Has the deeds locked up tight in his safe," Mabel affirmed. "But money talks, and the railroad has plenty of it. They've bought themselves a few friends in the territorial government, from what I hear." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of childish voices approaching the cabin. Mabel straightened, her expression brightening as she smoothly changed the subject. "I'd best be getting back to my baking," she said at a normal volume. "You and Matthew must come for supper one evening. Charlie makes a fine venison stew." The door burst open and Matthew rushed in, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama Emily showed me the new foal in the barn. It was just born yesterday and it's already standing up." Emily followed more sedately, her solemn blue eyes taking in the scene with that unnerving directness Rebecca was beginning to recognize. "Hello, Mrs. Baker," she said politely. "Papa went to talk to the badman, didn't he?" Mabel's smile faltered slightly. Your papa's just gone to check on the north pasture, love. Nothing for you to worry about. Emily's expression remained serious. They want our land, but they can't have it. Papa says it's our heritage. She pronounced the last word carefully, as if it held special significance. That's right, dear. Mabel agreed, exchanging a glance with Rebecca. Now, why don't you show Matthew the apple tree? The early ones might be ripe enough for picking. The children needed no further encouragement, darting back out the door with the boundless energy of youth. When they were gone, Mabel sighed. That child sees too much, she murmured, just like her mother did. It's a blessing and a curse, that sight of hers. Rebecca thought of Emily's knowledge of the blue dress of Matthew's birthday. Do you believe in such things, Mrs. Baker's second sight, I mean? Mabel considered the question seriously. I've lived long enough to know there are things in this world that can't be explained by ordinary means, she said finally. Clara Sullivan knew things no one told her, knew when Charlie's mother was going to pass 3 states away before the telegram ever arrived, knew when the spring would be dry a year before it happened. She shook her head. Some folks called it witchcraft, but I call it a gift. God-given, same as any other talent. Rebecca wasn't sure she shared the older woman's certainty, but she appreciated her matter-of-fact acceptance of what to others might seem supernatural. Emily said something about her mother teaching her to listen with more than her ears, she recalled. Mabel nodded. That sounds like Clara. She always said the world speaks to us in many ways if only we'd listen. She gathered her empty basket, preparing to leave. Emily's been lost since her mother died. Needs someone who understands her special way of seeing things. The words carried an unmistakable hint that Rebecca might be that someone, an implication she wasn't ready to address. Instead, she thanked Mabel again for the food and walked her to the door. As the older woman departed, Rebecca found herself standing on the porch gazing toward the distant hills, where presumably Everett Sullivan was confronting the bad men Emily had mentioned. The peaceful refuge she had glimpsed yesterday was revealing itself to be more complicated than she had imagined. She should feel dismayed by these complications, she knew. Their precarious situation called for caution for avoiding entanglements that might threaten the fragile security they had found. Yet as she watched Matthew and Emily beneath the apple tree, their heads bent together in earnest conversation, she couldn't summon the familiar urge to flee. Perhaps it was weariness or the simple comfort of having a roof over their heads and food in their bellies. Or perhaps it was something else, the strange sense of rightness she had felt upon seeing the Sullivan Ranch from the hilltop, as if some part of her had recognized it as a place where they might belong. Whatever the reason, Rebecca found herself resolving to stay, at least for now. To learn more about Everett Sullivan and his gifted daughter, about the land dispute that shadowed their lives, and about the peculiar circumstances that had brought her and Matthew to this remote Montana ranch. Little did she know that her decision to remain would set in motion a chain of events that would uncover long-buried secrets, challenge everything she believed about her husband's death, and ultimately offer her a second chance at happiness if she had the courage to seize it. Late that afternoon, Rebecca was hanging freshly washed linens on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of horses approaching. She shaded her eyes against the westering sun to see Everett and Charlie returning from their confrontation at the north pasture. Even from a distance, Rebecca could read tension in Everett's posture, the rigid set of his shoulders, the tight grip he maintained on the reins. Whatever had transpired at the boundary line, it hadn't been resolved to his satisfaction. She continued with her task, not wanting to appear to be prying into her employer's affairs, but she kept a surreptitious watch as the men dismounted near the barn. Their conversation was too distant to overhear, but their grave expressions suggested serious matters were being discussed. After a few minutes, Charlie led both horses into the barn, while Everett stood alone staring toward the distant hills with an expression that mingled anger and something that might have been grief. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned and looked directly at her. Rebecca quickly returned her attention to the laundry, feeling heat rise in her cheeks at being caught watching. By the time she risked another glance, Everett was walking toward the main house, his long strides eating up the distance with purpose. She finished hanging the last sheet, then gathered her empty basket and headed back to the cabin. As she rounded the corner, she nearly collided with Emily, who stood as still as a small statue in the middle of the path. "Oh," Rebecca exclaimed, startled by the child's silent presence. "Emily, I didn't see you there." The little girl's blue eyes were wide and serious. "Papa's upset," she stated matter-of-factly. "The bad men said mean things about Mama." Rebecca hesitated, uncertain how to respond to this declaration. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said finally. "Where's Matthew?" "He's helping Charlie feed the horses," Emily replied, seemingly unconcerned by the abrupt change of subject. "Mrs. Simmons, do you know about the papers in the box?" Rebecca's breath caught. "What box, Emily?" The child tilted her head as if listening to a voice only she could hear. "The metal box behind the painting. The one with the important papers." She looked directly at Rebecca, her gaze disconcertingly adult. The papers that would make the bad men go away. Before Rebecca could formulate a response to this cryptic statement, Everett's voice called from the direction of the house. "Emily, time to wash up for supper." Emily gave Rebecca one last significant look, then turned and skipped toward the house, without another word, leaving Rebecca standing alone with her empty laundry basket and a growing sense that there was far more to the Sullivan household than met the eye. As she entered the cabin, Rebecca's gaze fell on her carpet bag still resting on the chair, where she'd left it after unpacking their meager belongings. On impulse, she opened it and reached into the innermost pocket, withdrawing a small daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame, the only image she had of William. She studied her husband's face, so familiar, yet increasingly distant as time passed. William Simmons smiled solemnly from the photograph, his dark hair neatly combed, his Sunday suit buttoned precisely to the collar. It was a formal portrait taken shortly after their wedding that captured little of the warmth and humor she remembered in her husband. What would William advise her to do now? Stay and become involved in the Sullivans' troubles, or move on as they had done so many times before when situations grew complicated? "I'm trying to do right by our boy," she whispered to the image, "to find us a home." The photograph offered no answers, only the silent, steady gaze of a man 5 years dead. Rebecca carefully returned it to the carpet bag, her decision already made, though she hardly acknowledged it even to herself. They would stay at least until she understood more about the strange circumstances they had stumbled into. As she prepared a simple supper for herself and Matthew, Rebecca couldn't shake Emily's words from her mind. The metal box behind the painting, the papers that would make the bad men go away. What had the child meant, and how could she possibly know about such things? Rebecca had always prided herself on her practical nature, her resistance to superstition and fancy. But Emily Sullivan's uncanny perceptions challenged her rational understanding of the world. Was it truly possible for a child to know things she couldn't possibly have learned through ordinary means? Her musings were interrupted by Matthew's return, his face glowing with excitement as he burst through the door. "Mama Charlie showed me how to feed the horses, and I got to brush the big bay. One his name is Thunder, and Emily says maybe tomorrow I can collect eggs from the chicken coop if I'm very careful not to scare the hens." Rebecca smiled at his enthusiasm, grateful to see him so animated after months of quiet withdrawal. "That sounds wonderful, sweet pea. Wash your hands now. Supper's nearly ready." As they ate, Matthew chattered happily about his day's adventures, pausing only to take hurried bites of the simple meal Rebecca had prepared. She listened with genuine pleasure, asking questions and encouraging his excitement. This was the boy she remembered from before William's death, curious, eager, full of life. "Emily says her papa wants us to come to supper at the big house tomorrow," Matthew announced as he finished his meal. "Can we go? Mama Emily says Mrs. Baker is making apple pie." Rebecca hesitated, caught between a desire to maintain professional distance and the practical reality that they would be living in close proximity to the Sullivans for the foreseeable future. Did Mr. Sullivan actually issue this invitation, or is this something Emily said on her own? Matthew considered this, his small brow furrowing. Emily said it, but she says her papa was thinking about it before he went to talk to the bad men. The phrase sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. "Matthew, what do you know about these bad men Emily mentioned?" Her son shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation now that his plate was empty. "Just that they want to take Emily's home away. She says they hurt her mama, but that was before when she was little." Rebecca's unease deepened. What exactly had happened to Clara Sullivan? And what did it have to do with the current land dispute? "Matthew," she said carefully, "has Emily told you anything else about her mother, about how she passed away?" Matthew shook his head. "No, she just said her mama could hear things like she can, and that's why the bad men didn't like her." He yawned, the long day of exploration and excitement finally catching up with him. "Can I go to bed now, Mama? I'm tired." Rebecca helped him wash and change into his nightshirt, tucking him into the trundle bed with a tender kiss on his forehead. He was asleep almost immediately, his breathing deep and even in the quiet cabin. Alone with her thoughts, Rebecca moved restlessly around the small space, too unsettled for sleep despite her own fatigue. Emily's cryptic comments, Mabel's warnings about the railroad men, Everett's obvious distress upon returning from the boundary dispute, all of it pointed to troubles deeper and more complex than a simple property disagreement. On impulse, she stepped outside onto the small porch drawn by the need for fresh air and open space to clear her mind. The night was clear and cool, the sky a vast canopy of stars above the dark silhouette of distant mountains. From somewhere in the darkness came the lonesome howl of a coyote, answered moments later by another far away. The main house was mostly dark, only a single lamp burning in what Rebecca guessed must be Everett's study. As she watched, a shadow moved across the window, Everett pacing perhaps, or searching for something among his papers. The metal box behind the painting, the papers that would make the bad men go away. Emily's words returned to her, insistent and troubling. What if the child truly did know something important, something that could help resolve the conflict threatening the Sullivan Ranch? Rebecca shook her head, dismissing the fanciful thought. She was letting her imagination run away with her, influenced by the child's solemn certainty and the mysterious atmosphere of this isolated ranch. Tomorrow, in the clear light of day, she would begin her duties as housekeeper and put aside these wild speculations. She turned to go back inside, but a movement at the edge of her vision made her pause. A figure was crossing the yard from the direction of the bunkhouse, Charlie Baker, recognizable by his lanky frame, even in the dim starlight. He moved with purpose toward the main house, something clutched in his hand. Rebecca watched as he mounted the porch steps and knocked softly on the door. Moments later, Everett appeared silhouetted briefly against the light from inside before both men disappeared into the house. Something was happening. Some development in the ongoing conflict, perhaps. Rebecca knew she should go inside, should respect the privacy of her employer and his affairs. Yet she remained on the porch, her curiosity warring with her sense of propriety. The light in Everett's study flared brighter, then dimmed again as shadows moved across the window. The men appeared to be examining something, papers, perhaps, or a map. Their discussion, whatever it entailed, seemed intense. After several minutes, Charlie emerged from the house and headed back toward the bunkhouse, his stride purposeful. The light in Everett's study remained on his shadow, occasionally visible, as he moved about the room. Rebecca finally turned away, chiding herself for her unseemly curiosity. Whatever business Everett Sullivan conducted in the privacy of his home was not her concern. Her duty was to care for the household and look after Emily, nothing more. Yet as she prepared for bed in the quiet cabin, Matthew's soft breathing the only sound in the darkness, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something larger and more complex than she had initially believed. The Sullivan Ranch harbored secrets. Secrets that somehow, inexplicably, Emily seemed privy to, despite her tender age. Tomorrow, Rebecca resolved, as she slipped beneath the covers, she would begin to unravel the mystery of the Sullivans and their troubled ranch. For Matthew's sake, if nothing else, she needed to understand what kind of situation they had walked into. With that determination in mind, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with faceless men on horseback, a small blonde child with knowing eyes, and a metal box hidden behind a painting, a box that somehow held the key to everything. The following days settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Rebecca. Rising with the sun, she attended to the daily task of managing the Sullivan household, preparing meals, mending clothes, keeping the sprawling ranch house in order. It was honest work, the kind she'd done in her own home before William's death, and there was comfort in the familiar routines. Emily proved to be a quiet, helpful child despite her uncanny perceptions. She followed Rebecca around the house, eager to assist with simple chores and seemingly content with the company. Matthew, meanwhile, shadowed Charlie Baker, learning about the horses and cattle with the enthusiastic absorption of a boy who had spent too long confined to city boarding houses. Everett maintained a respectful distance, leaving the house early each morning to tend to ranch business and returning for meals with little conversation beyond pleasantries. Yet Rebecca often caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, his expression unreadable. A week after their arrival, Rebecca was in the kitchen preparing the midday meal when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Through the window, she saw a smart buggy coming up the drive, driven by a woman elegantly dressed in a burgundy traveling suit, her posture ramrod straight, even on the rutted ranch road. The sight of such finery so far from town was unexpected. Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch just as the buggy drew to a halt before the house. The woman who descended was perhaps 40, with carefully arranged auburn hair beneath a fashionable hat. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, with sharp features and shrewd eyes that assessed Rebecca with unconcealed curiosity. "Good day," the woman called, her voice carrying the refined accent of the eastern states. "I'm looking for Mr. Sullivan. He's out checking the north pasture," Rebecca replied, keeping her tone polite but neutral. "He should return shortly for the midday meal. May I tell him who's calling?" The woman's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Victoria Hammond. My late husband owned the mercantile in Silver Creek." She paused, clearly expecting the name to carry significance. "Rebecca Simmons," Rebecca replied with a small nod. "I'm the new housekeeper." Something flickered in Victoria Hammond's eyes, surprise perhaps, or calculation. "How interesting. Everett didn't mention he'd hired anyone new." She ascended the porch steps with practiced grace. "I'll wait for him inside if you don't mind." It wasn't a request so much as a statement delivered with the assurance of someone accustomed to deference. Rebecca stepped aside, allowing the woman to enter the house, though a flicker of unease passed through her at the familiar way Victoria referred to Everett. "May I offer you tea while you wait, Mrs. Hammond?" Rebecca asked, following her into the parlor. Victoria removed her gloves, looking around the room with a critical eye. "Yes, thank you. It's a warm day for a drive from town." She settled onto the settee, arranging her skirts with practiced precision. "How long have you been employed here, Mrs. Simmons?" "Just over a week," Rebecca answered, maintaining her professional composure despite the woman's thinly veiled interrogation. "And you came from Missouri most recently?" Rebecca kept her response deliberately vague, unwilling to share her history with this stranger, whose interest seemed excessive for simple curiosity. Victoria's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. How fortunate for Everett to find a housekeeper from so far away. Help can be so difficult to secure in these remote areas. Before Rebecca could respond, the patter of small feet announced Emily's arrival. The child appeared in the doorway, her expression unusually guarded as she regarded their visitor. "Hello, Miss Victoria," she said, her normally confident voice subdued. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Emily, dear, how lovely to see you. You're growing so tall." Emily didn't move from the doorway. "Papa's not going to be happy you're here." Rebecca intervened quickly, embarrassed by the child's bluntness. "Emily, that's not a polite way to greet a guest. Mrs. Hammond is kind enough to wait for your father." She turned to Victoria with an apologetic smile. "I'll prepare that tea now." In the kitchen, Rebecca busied herself with the tea tray, her mind turning over the strange undercurrents she'd sensed between Victoria Hammond and Emily. The child's wariness seemed at odds with her normally open nature, and Victoria's perfectly cordial words had carried a hint of something less benevolent beneath their polished surface. When she returned to the parlor with the tea tray, Emily had disappeared, and Victoria stood by the mantelpiece examining a small framed photograph. She replaced it quickly as Rebecca entered, but not before Rebecca glimpsed what appeared to be a wedding portrait, Everett standing beside a slender woman with pale hair and a gentle smile. Clara Sullivan, she presumed the woman whose gift Emily had inherited. "Such a tragic loss," Victoria commented, nodding toward the photograph as she accepted a cup of tea. "Clara was so young, and to leave behind a small child." She shook her head in practiced sympathy that somehow rang hollow. Rebecca made a non-committal sound, unwilling to engage in gossip about her employer's late wife. "Sugar or milk, Mrs. Hammond?" Victoria waved a dismissive hand. "Neither, thank you. I've known Everett since he first came to Silver Creek, you know. My husband, God rest his soul, sold him the lumber for this very house." She sipped her tea, eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. He was different then, more optimistic, before Clara's unfortunate tendencies became apparent. Rebecca stiffened, understanding exactly what the woman was implying. "I should check on the bread," she said, setting down her untouched tea. "Please excuse me." In the kitchen, Rebecca pressed her hands against the solid wood of the table, steadying herself against a surge of unexpected anger. Victoria Hammond's casual slander of Clara Sullivan, a woman she had never met, but whose child's well-being was now partly in her care, struck a chord that resonated with her own experiences as a widow, subject to the judgments and whispers of others. The sound of hoofbeats outside announced Everett's return. Through the window, Rebecca watched him dismount and hand the reins to Charlie, his movements easy and assured. He was halfway to the house when he noticed Victoria's buggy. His stride faltered momentarily before resuming with a tension that hadn't been there before. Rebecca busied herself at the stove, listening to the murmur of voices from the parlor. Though she couldn't distinguish individual words, the tone of the conversation shifted quickly from polite greetings to something more heated. Victoria's refined voice rose in what sounded like accusation, met by Everett's deeper tones, controlled but firm. After several minutes, the parlor door opened, and Everett appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression carefully neutral, though a muscle worked in his jaw. "Mrs. Simmons, I apologize for the interruption to your day," he said formally. "Mrs. Hammond is leaving now." Rebecca nodded, keeping her own expression equally composed. "Of course. Will you still take your midday meal, or shall I keep it warm for later?" "Later, if you wouldn't mind. I need to see Mrs. Hammond out." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "If Emily asks, please tell her everything is fine. There's no need for her to worry." The front door closed moments later, and through the window, Rebecca watched Everett hand Victoria into her buggy with cold courtesy. Whatever their conversation had entailed, it had clearly ended poorly. Victoria's normally perfect posture was rigid with suppressed emotion as she took up the reins and guided the buggy down the drive with more speed than grace. Everett remained on the porch long after the buggy had disappeared, staring toward the distant hills as if seeking answers, or perhaps escape in their unchanging slopes. Only when Charlie approached with a question about the day's work did he seem to shake off his preoccupation and return to the present. Rebecca returned to her cooking, determined not to speculate about matters that didn't concern her. Yet Victoria Hammond's visit had disturbed the tranquil routine of the past week, introducing an element of discord that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the Sullivan home. She was setting bread dough to rise when Emily slipped into the kitchen, her small face solemn. "Miss Victoria is a bad person," she announced without preamble. "She pretends to be Papa's friend, but she's not." Rebecca rinsed the flour from her hands, choosing her words carefully. "It's not polite to speak ill of others, Emily." The child's blue eyes were unnervingly direct. "Even if it's true, Mama always said we should tell the truth even when it's hard." Rebecca sighed, recognizing the trap of adult logic applied through a child's literal understanding. "There's a difference between honesty and unkindness," she said gently. "We can be truthful without saying hurtful things about others." Emily considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. "But what if someone is planning to do something bad? Shouldn't we warn people?" A chill ran down Rebecca's spine despite the warmth of the kitchen. "Has someone told you they're planning to do something bad, Emily?" The little girl's gaze slid away, suddenly evasive. "I just know things sometimes, like Mama did." Before Rebecca could press further, Matthew burst into the kitchen, his face alight with excitement. "Mama, Charlie says I can help him mend the corral fence if you say it's all right." The moment of connection with Emily was broken. Rebecca smiled at her son, relieved to see him so animated after months of quiet withdrawal. "That sounds like a fine idea as long as you're careful and do exactly as Charlie tells you." As Matthew darted back outside, Rebecca turned to find Emily watching her with that disconcerting intensity that seemed beyond her years. "He's happy you're here," the child observed. "So are you. You don't cry at night anymore." Rebecca froze, the simple statement striking her like a physical blow. She had indeed wept silently many nights since William's death, always after Matthew was asleep, releasing the grief and fears she kept tightly controlled during daylight hours. But she had never cried at the Sullivan Ranch. The exhaustion of honest work and the security of a locked door had granted her dreamless sleep for the first time in months. "How would you know if I cried at night, Emily?" she asked carefully. The child shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "I just know. Like I know Papa keeps a gun in his desk now, and Miss Victoria is working with the bad men, even though she pretends she isn't." Before Rebecca could respond to this alarming statement, Everett appeared in the doorway, his expression clearing slightly at the sight of his daughter. "There you are, sunshine," he said, his voice gentling, as it always did when he addressed Emily. "I thought we might ride out to check on the new foal this afternoon. Would you like that?" Emily's face brightened, her previous solemnity vanishing like morning mist under sunlight. "Can Matthew come too? He's never ridden a horse before." Everett glanced at Rebecca, a question in his eyes. "If Mrs. Simmons approves and if Matthew would like to join us." Rebecca hesitated, torn between caution and the desire to see Matthew experience simple childhood pleasures. He's helping Charlie with the corral fence at the moment, but I'm sure he'd love to go afterward if it's not too much trouble. No trouble at all, Everett assured her. We'll take the gentle mares. I've taught younger children than Matthew to ride. As he turned to leave, Rebecca found herself speaking before she'd fully formed the thought. Mr. Sullivan, may I ask who Mrs. Hammond is? She seemed quite familiar with your household. Everett paused, something flickering in his eyes that might have been wariness or simply surprise at her directness. Victoria Hammond is a prominent citizen in Silver Creek. Her late husband owned several businesses in town, including the mercantile and the hotel. She's continued managing them since his death. It was a perfectly proper answer that told her nothing about the woman's connection to the Sullivan family or the reason for her visit. Rebecca recognized the deliberate omission, but knew she had no right to press further. I see, she said simply. Your meal will be ready whenever you'd like it. Everett nodded, hesitated, as if he might say more, then departed with Emily skipping at his side. Rebecca returned to her bread making, trying to dismiss Victoria Hammond and her cryptic warnings from her mind. Yet Emily's words echoed troublingly. Miss Victoria is working with the bad men, even though she pretends she isn't. What bad men could a 4-year-old child be referring to with such certainty? The railroad representatives who disputed Everett's claim to the North Pasture, or something else entirely? Rebecca shook her head, chiding herself for giving credence to a child's fanciful statements. Emily was perceptive, certainly, but she was still only 4 years old with a child's tendency to simplify complex adult matters into stark categories of good and bad. Yet there had been something in Victoria Hammond's manner, a calculating assessment beneath her polished courtesy that had raised Rebecca's instinctive wariness. And Everett's reaction to her visit had been unmistakably negative, though he'd maintained rigid control of his emotions. As she worked, Rebecca found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the parlor where Victoria had examined the photograph on the mantelpiece. What had the woman been about to say about Clara Sullivan's unfortunate tendencies before Rebecca had cut her off? On impulse, Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the parlor. The room was silent and still, afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows to illuminate the comfortable but simple furnishings. The photograph Victoria had been examining still stood on the mantelpiece, a formal wedding portrait showing a younger Everett beside a slender woman with light hair arranged in an elegant knot. Clara Sullivan had been beautiful in a quiet, luminous way, her eyes clear and direct, even in the formal pose of a wedding portrait. There was something familiar about her face that Rebecca couldn't quite place a resemblance to someone she had met, perhaps. She was about to turn away when she noticed another photograph partially hidden behind a small china figurine. This one was less formal, a group of men standing before what appeared to be a mine entrance. Rebecca recognized Everett, immediately younger but unmistakable with his tall frame and serious expression. Beside him stood another man whose face made her heart stop in her chest. William. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the photograph for closer examination. There could be no mistake. Though the image was slightly faded, the man standing beside Everett was undoubtedly her husband, William Simmons. Rebecca sank onto the nearest chair, the photograph clutched in her suddenly nerveless fingers. How was this possible? William had never mentioned knowing Everett Sullivan. He had worked in mines across 3 states, yes, but he had never spoken of Montana or a man named Sullivan. Yet here was evidence that not only had they known each other, but they had been close enough to be photographed together. And Everett had never mentioned recognizing William's name when she introduced herself as Rebecca Simmons. The implications raced through her mind, each more disturbing than the last. Had Everett known who she was all along? Had their meeting at the train station been not chance but design? Emily's words from their first meeting echoed in her memory. Just like I said we would find them. The child had known they would be at the station. She had known Matthew's name, his birthday, even the blue dress packed at the bottom of Rebecca's carpetbag. A cold certainty settled in Rebecca's chest. Everett Sullivan had known exactly who she was before he ever offered her employment. The question was why. The sound of bootsteps on the perch startled her from her thoughts. Rebecca hastily replaced the photograph behind the figurine and returned to the kitchen, her mind whirling with questions she dared not ask directly. Everett entered a moment later, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "Something smells good," he commented, his tone casual though his eyes were watchful. Rebecca managed a smile that felt stiff on her face. "Just bread baking. Your meal is ready if you'd like it now. He nodded, seating himself at the kitchen table as she served the simple fare beef stew, fresh bread, and garden vegetables. He ate with the hearty appetite of a man who had worked since dawn, but Rebecca noticed his gaze returning to her face more than once, as if assessing her mood. Mrs. Hammond's visit seemed to upset you, he observed, finally, his tone carefully neutral. Rebecca stiffened, surprised by his directness. Not at all. It's not my place to have opinions about your visitors, Mr. Sullivan. A faint smile touched his lips there and gone in an instant. That's diplomatically put, but I saw your face when you brought in the tea tray. Victoria has that effect on many people. Rebecca hesitated, torn between proper reserve and the need to understand the complex dynamics she had stumbled into. She seemed very interested in your affairs, she said carefully. Everett's expression closed like a door shutting. Victoria believes she has a stake in how I manage my ranch and raise my daughter. She's mistaken. He pushed back from the table, his meal only half finished. Thank you for the food, Mrs. Simmons. I promised Emily we'd check on the foal. We'll take Matthew if he's still interested. He left before she could respond, his sudden withdrawal making it clear that the subject of Victoria Hammond was closed. Rebecca cleared the table mechanically, her mind still processing the discovery of William's photograph and its implications. Whatever connection had existed between William and Everett, it seemed Everett had no intention of acknowledging it. And that more than anything raised Rebecca's suspicions. What possible reason could he have for concealing their prior acquaintance unless it's somehow related to William's death? The thought chilled her. She had accepted the mining company's account of the accident that had killed William, a cave-in caused by improper shoring, a tragedy, but not an uncommon one in the dangerous world of mining. She had been too consumed by grief and the immediate struggle for survival to question the official explanation or pursue the matter further. But now, faced with evidence that William had known Everett Sullivan, a man who was himself in conflict with powerful interests, Rebecca found herself revisiting the circumstances of her husband's death with growing unease. She was still deep in thought when Matthew burst into the kitchen, his face flushed with excitement. Mama, Mr. Sullivan says I can ride a horse, a real one, not just sit behind him. He says there's a gentle mare that would be perfect for beginners. His eyes shone with anticipation. Can I go? Please. Rebecca forced a smile, pushing aside her troubled thoughts. Of course you may, if Mr. Sullivan thinks you're ready. But you must be very careful and do exactly as he tells you. Matthew's whoop of joy was answer enough. He dashed back outside, calling to Emily, who waited on the porch. Through the window, Rebecca watched them run toward the barn, where Everett was saddling 3 horses, 2 full-size mounts, and a smaller pony that would be perfect for Emily's short legs. The sight of her son's happiness created a painful knot in Rebecca's chest. Matthew had suffered too much loss, too much upheaval in his young life. He was finally beginning to thrive in the stable environment of the Sullivan Ranch, forming attachments to Emily, to Charlie Baker, even to Everett himself. If Rebecca's suspicions proved founded, if there was some sinister connection between Everett and William's death, how could she possibly uproot Matthew again without breaking his fragile recovery? Yet how could she remain accepting Everett's hospitality and employment if the man had deceived her from the very beginning? Rebecca moved through the rest of her afternoon tasks mechanically, her mind churning with unanswerable questions. By the time she heard the riders returning, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the prairie in hues of gold and amber. Matthew's face as he dismounted told the story of a perfect afternoon. He could speak of nothing else through supper, recounting every detail of his riding lesson and the foal they had visited, how its spindly legs had seemed too long for its body, how it had nuzzled his palm with a velvet nose, how Emily had known the exact spot where it liked to be scratched. Rebecca listened with genuine pleasure despite her inner turmoil, grateful for her son's happiness, whatever complications might lie ahead. When he finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep almost as soon as his head touched the pillow, she tucked the blanket around his small form with a surge of fierce protectiveness. Whatever secrets the Sullivan Ranch harbored, whatever connection existed between Everett and William, she would not allow Matthew to be hurt by them. His well-being came first above all other considerations. With Matthew settled for the night, Rebecca found herself too restless for sleep. She stepped outside onto the small porch, seeking solace in the vast, starlit sky that arched overhead. The night was clear and cool, the silence broken only by the distant cry of a coyote and the soft rustling of wind through prairie grass. From her vantage point, she could see a light still burning in Everett's study window in the main house. A shadow moved across the illuminated glass. Everett, pacing perhaps, or searching through papers at his desk. Rebecca's thoughts returned to Emily's cryptic words, "Papa keeps a gun in his desk now." What had prompted such a measure? The dispute with the railroad men seemed serious but hardly warranted armed preparation, unless there was more to the conflict than she had been told. As she watched the light in Everett's study dimmed and went out, minutes later the faint sound of a door opening and closing carried across the quiet yard. Everett's tall figure emerged from the house, moving with purpose toward the barn. Rebecca hesitated, torn between proper discretion and burning curiosity. It was none of her business what Everett Sullivan did on his own property after dark. Yet the discovery of William's photograph had changed everything. If there was a connection between Everett and her husband, she had a need to understand it. Decision made, Rebecca stepped off the porch and followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. The night was bright enough to navigate without a lantern, the quarter moon casting a silver glow over the ranch yard. Everett entered the barn without lighting a lamp, suggesting he knew exactly what he sought and where to find it. Rebecca approached, cautiously alert for any sound that might betray her presence. The barn door stood slightly ajar, allowing her to peer inside without entering. At first, she could see nothing in the cavernous darkness. Then her eyes adjusted, and she made out Everett's silhouette moving toward the back of the building. He knelt beside what appeared to be a loose floorboard, prying it up with practiced ease to reveal a hidden compartment beneath. Rebecca held her breath, watching as he withdrew something from the space, a leather satchel, from what she could discern in the dim light. He opened it, examining the contents briefly before returning it to its hiding place and replacing the floorboard. As he straightened and turned toward the door, Rebecca backed away, hastily retreating to the shadow of a nearby wagon. Her heart hammered in her chest as Everett emerged from the barn, his expression grim in the moonlight. He paused, looking around as if sensing he was not alone, and Rebecca pressed herself more firmly against the wagon's wheel. After a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, Everett continued toward the house, his stride purposeful. Only when he had disappeared inside did Rebecca release the breath she'd been holding. What had she just witnessed? What documents were so important or so dangerous that they needed to be hidden beneath the barn floor rather than kept in the house, and what did they have to do with William? Rebecca made her way back to the cabin, her mind racing with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. If Everett Sullivan was hiding something connected to William's death, she needed to discover what it was, not only for her own peace of mind, but for Matthew's future security. Tomorrow, she resolved, as she slipped quietly into the cabin, she would find a way to examine the contents of that hidden satchel. For tonight, she would try to sleep to gather her strength for whatever revelations might lie ahead. But sleep proved elusive, her dreams, when they came filled with the fractured images. William standing at the mouth of a dark mine, Everett Sullivan watching from the shadows. Victoria Hammond's cold smile, and Emily always. Emily with her two knowing eyes and cryptic warnings about bad men and hidden papers. Morning brought a welcome distraction in the form of Mabel Baker, who arrived earlier than usual, her arms full of garden produce and her face alight with news. "The circuit preacher's in town," she announced as she deposited her bounty on the kitchen table. "Reverend Hollister only comes through every few months. There'll be a service Sunday followed by a community picnic." She beamed at Rebecca. "The whole ranch always attends. It'll be a fine chance for you and Matthew to meet the respectable folk of Silver Creek." Rebecca managed a smile, though the prospect of public scrutiny made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. As a widow traveling alone with a young child, she had encountered enough suspicious glances and whispered judgments to last a lifetime. "That sounds lovely," she said with more enthusiasm than she felt. "I'm sure Matthew would enjoy the company of other children." Mabel's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Don't you fret about the town gossips," she said firmly. "You'll be with the Sullivan household, and that counts for something in these parts. Everett's well respected, whatever Victoria Hammond and her ilk might whisper." The mention of Victoria immediately captured Rebecca's attention. "Mrs. Hammond seems to take a particular interest in the Sullivan family," she observed, keeping her tone casual as she began sorting through Mabel's garden offerings. Mabel snorted inelegantly. That woman's had her sights set on Everett since before Clara passed, God rest her soul. Wasn't proper about it either, making eyes at a married man finding excuses to call it the ranch when Clara was confined with Emily. She shook her head in disapproval. Some folks have no shame. Rebecca absorbed this information, fitting it into the complex puzzle she was attempting to assemble. I had the impression yesterday that there was some tension between them. Mrs. Hammond seemed upset when she left. No doubt, Mabel agreed, lowering her voice though they were alone in the kitchen. Victoria's been pushing Everett to sell the North Pasture to the railroad for months now. Claims it would bring progress to Silver Creek, more jobs and such. Her expression made it clear what she thought of this argument. Truth is, she stands to profit handsomely if the spur line goes through. She owns half the commercial properties in town. And Mr. Sullivan refuses to sell, Rebecca prompted when Mabel paused. Wouldn't even consider it. Mabel's voice held a note of pride. That land's been in the Sullivan family since his father homesteaded here. Besides, Everett knows what those railroad men are really like. Saw it firsthand during his mining days. Rebecca's pulse quickened. His mining days? Before he took over the ranch, Mabel explained, oblivious to Rebecca's sudden intense interest. Worked as a surveyor for several companies back east. That's how he met Clara. Her brother was an engineer for the same outfit. She sighed, her expression softening. Such a sweet girl Clara was. Never had an unkind word for anyone despite how some folks treated her. Rebecca's mind was racing, attempting to connect these new pieces of information with what she already knew. Everett had worked for mining companies. He had met Clara through her brother, an engineer, and now he was in conflict with the railroad over land that might hold significant value. Was the mining company Everett worked for connected to the railroad? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing excitement. Mabel gave her a curious look. Same owners from what I understand. The Northeastern Development Company. They've got their fingers in everything from coal to timber to railroads. She paused, studying Rebecca's face. Why all the questions about ancient history? Rebecca forced a casual shrug. Just trying to understand my new surroundings. It helps to know the background of the household when you're responsible for its care. Mabel seemed satisfied with this explanation, turning the conversation to preparations for Sunday's church service and picnic. Rebecca listened with half an ear, her mind still processing this new information. The Northeastern Development Company. The name was vaguely familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she had heard it before. Had William mentioned it in connection with his own mining work? It seemed possible, even likely given the photograph she had discovered. As Mabel chattered on about which dishes would be expected at the picnic and what Rebecca and Matthew might wear to make a good impression, Rebecca's thoughts were far away, assembling the scattered pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take disturbing shape. If Everett had worked for the same company that had employed William, if they had known each other as the photograph suggested, why had he concealed this connection, and what was in the satchel hidden beneath the barn floor that he felt the need to check on after Victoria Hammond's visit? Emily's words echoed in her mind, the papers that would make the bad men go away. Could those papers be in the hidden satchel? And were the bad men representatives of the Northeastern Development Company, the same company that had dismissed William's death as an unfortunate accident? The possibility sent a chill down Rebecca's spine despite the warmth of the kitchen. If her suspicions were correct, if William's death had been connected to something he had discovered about the company's practices, then Everett Sullivan might have information vital to understanding her husband's fate. And if that were true, she needed to find it not only for her own peace of mind, but for Matthew's future. The company had paid a minimal death benefit, barely enough to cover William's burial expenses. If his death had been due to negligence or worse, Matthew might be entitled to more substantial compensation. Rebecca's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Emily and Matthew bursting into the kitchen with the boundless energy of young children. Emily's face lit up at the sight of Mabel, whom she greeted with enthusiastic affection. "Mrs. Baker, did you bring honey cakes you promised last time?" The child's normally solemn demeanor vanished in the presence of the motherly older woman. Mabel laughed, reaching into her basket to produce a small package wrapped in wax paper. "As if I'd forget such a promise. There's enough for you and Matthew both if your appetites haven't grown too much since last week." The children accepted the treats with eager thanks, Matthew remembering his manners enough to look to Rebecca for permission before taking his first bite. The simple domestic scene, children enjoying a special treat, Mabel's indulgent smile, the warm sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, created a poignant contrast to the dark suspicions forming in Rebecca's mind. This could be a real home for them, she thought with sudden clarity. If circumstances were different, if there weren't secrets and hidden connections shadowing their presence here, the Sullivan Ranch could become the stable, nurturing environment Matthew so desperately needed. The realization strengthened her resolve. She would discover the truth about William's connection to Everett Sullivan and the Northeastern Development Company. And she would do it soon, before Matthew became any more attached to this place and these people. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Everett announced he needed to ride into Silver Creek to meet with Elijah Davis, the store owner, about supplies for the coming winter. He would be gone most of the day, and Charlie would accompany him to help transport the goods back to the ranch. "Emily can stay with you if that's not imposing," he told Rebecca, his tone making it clear this was a request rather than an assumption. Of course, Rebecca agreed readily, her mind already calculating how this unexpected absence might serve her purposes. "The children can help me gather vegetables from the garden. I thought I might put up some preserves while you're away." Everett's expression softened slightly at her willing acceptance of the additional responsibility. "Thank you, Mrs. Simmons. I don't like leaving Emily with just anyone. She can be challenging for those who don't understand her ways." The genuine concern in his voice caused a flicker of guilt in Rebecca's chest. Despite her suspicions, she couldn't deny that Everett was a devoted father who wanted only the best for his unusual child. But the memory of William's photograph steeled her resolve. If Everett Sullivan knew something about William's death, something he had deliberately concealed from her, she had every right to discover it. She waved from the porch as Everett and Charlie departed, Emily and Matthew beside her. Only when the wagon had disappeared from view did she turn to the children with a deliberately cheerful smile. "Now then, who would like to help pick vegetables for our preserving? I think the green beans are ready for harvesting." The children eagerly agreed, always ready for an outdoor task that felt more like play than work. Rebecca equipped them with small baskets and clear instructions about which plants to pick from, then set them loose in the kitchen garden under the pretext of needing to prepare the preserving jars. As soon as they were absorbed in their task, Rebecca slipped away toward the barn, her heart pounding with a mixture of determination and apprehension. What she was about to do violated every principle of honesty and respect she had been raised to value. Yet the need to understand William's connection to this place, to these people, overrode her scruples. The barn was cool and dim after the bright sunshine outside. Rebecca paused inside the door, allowing her eyes to adjust to the shadows, while listening for any sound that might indicate she wasn't alone. But the building was quiet, save for the occasional stamping of a horse in its stall and the soft cooing of doves in the rafters. Moving as quietly as possible, Rebecca made her way to the back of the barn where she had seen Everett kneeling the night before. The exact location was difficult to pinpoint in daylight, the seemingly uniform floorboards offering no obvious indication of a hiding place. She knelt, running her fingers along the wooden planks, searching for any sign of a loose board or hidden compartment. Nothing. She shifted position, examining a different section of flooring. Still nothing. Frustration mounting, Rebecca sat back on her heels, surveying the area more systematically. Everett had been standing near the tack room she recalled, just beside a support post. She moved to that spot, examining the floorboards with renewed attention. There a slight gap between two boards, barely noticeable unless one was specifically looking for it. Rebecca worked her fingernails into the space, applying gentle pressure. The board shifted slightly, but didn't lift free. She glanced around, searching for something to use as a lever. A discarded horseshoe nail lay nearby. She snatched it up and wedged it into the gap, applying more substantial pressure. The board lifted with surprising ease, revealing a shallow space beneath. Rebecca's breath caught at the sight of the leather satchel nestled in the hollow. It was smaller than she had estimated from her nighttime glimpse, worn, but well-made, secured with a simple strap rather than a lock. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it from its hiding place. Whatever secrets Everett Sullivan was keeping, they were contained in this unassuming bag. Part of her wanted to return it unseen to preserve the fragile piece they had found at the ranch. But the larger part, the part that had survived a year of widowhood and desperate struggle, needed to know the truth, whatever it might be. She unfolded the leather strap and carefully opened the satchel. Inside were several items: a bundle of letters tied with string, a small leather-bound notebook, a folded document that appeared to be a map in a sealed envelope, dressed simply in a feminine hand for Emily when she is old enough to understand. Rebecca hesitated suddenly and uncertain. The letter to Emily seemed intensely personal, likely written by Clara Sullivan before her death. Reading it would be an inexcusable invasion of privacy with no relevance to her search for William's connection to Everett. She set the envelope aside and turned her attention to the bundle of letters. The topmost one bore a return address that made her heart skip a beat: William Simmons, Silver Peak Mining Company, Colorado Territory. Her fingers shook as she untied the string and opened the first letter. The familiar handwriting, William's bold, slanting script, blurred momentarily as tears filled her eyes. July 15th, 1881, Everett. I've confirmed what we suspected. The company records show systematic falsification of safety reports at all three mines. Supports rated at half their actual load, air quality measurements taken during shift changes, when ventilation is at its peak, and the most damning of all bribes to the territorial inspectors to overlook the violations. I've copied as much of the evidence as I could without raising suspicion, but Davidson is watching me closely. I don't think he suspects, but he's cautious by nature. The documents are too dangerous to send by post. I'll bring them when I come for Emma's christening next month. Clara's letter mentioned your troubles with the railroad survey. I'm not surprised they're trying the same tactics there as they've employed here. The Northeastern Development Company operates by the same playbook regardless of which subsidiary is involved. Create paper trails, manipulate, surveys, pressure land owners. When that fails, accidents happen. Be careful, old friend. These men don't hesitate to eliminate obstacles. If they suspect what we know, neither of us is safe. I've made arrangements for Rebecca and Matthew should anything happen to me. You'll find the details in the sealed letter I gave you at Christmas. Give my love to Clara and little Emily. Rebecca sends her warmest regards, though she still doesn't understand why I can't tell her about our work. Perhaps someday when this is finished, we can finally bring our families together properly. Your friend always. William. Rebecca stared at the letter, her mind struggling to process its implications. William had been investigating safety violations at the mining company. He had been in regular correspondence with Everett, whom he considered an old friend. And he had anticipated the possibility of his own death, making arrangements for her and Matthew that she had never known about. The ground seemed to shift beneath her as the narrative she had accepted for over a year, that William had died in a tragic but commonplace mining accident, crumbled in the face of this new evidence. If William's suspicions had been correct, if the company had discovered his investigation, his death might have been no accident at all. The thought sent a wave of nausea through her. She had grieved for William, had accepted the company's paltry compensation, had never questioned their account of the cave-in that had taken his life. All the while, the truth had been hidden in these letters, in the evidence William had gathered, in the knowledge Everett Sullivan had kept from her. Why hadn't Everett told her? Why had he pretended not to recognize her name when they met at the train station? And most disturbing of all, why had he never delivered the sealed letter? William mentioned the one containing arrangements for her and Matthew's welfare. She reached for the notebook, hoping it might contain answers to these questions. Inside, she found pages of neat, precise handwriting, Everett's, she presumed, detailing meetings, conversations, and evidence collected over a period of years. It appeared to be a record of a systematic investigation into the Northeastern Development Company's practices across multiple states and territories. Many entries mentioned William confirming their long collaboration in building a case against the company, but it was an entry dated 2 weeks after William's death that made Rebecca's blood run cold. April 30th, 1882. Davidson visited today ostensibly to offer condolences for William's death. His real purpose was clear enough to determine how much I know and whether William shared his evidence with me before the accident. I played the part of the grieving friend, ignorant of William's investigation. He mentioned Rebecca, and the boy said the company had provided for them generously, given the circumstances. When I asked what he meant, he smiled that cold snake smile of his and said, "Mining is dangerous work, especially for men who take risks where they shouldn't." The threat was unmistakable. They know what William was doing. They killed him for it, and they'll do the same to me if I pursue the matter. For Clara's sake, for Emily's, I've decided to withdraw from the investigation. The territorial prosecutor has agreed to hold the evidence we've already gathered securely. When the time is right, when I can be certain they won't retaliate against my family, I'll bring the case forward again. I should find Rebecca, tell her the truth, deliver the letter William left for her. But would that knowledge make her situation better or worse if she knew William was murdered? Wouldn't she demand justice regardless of the danger? I know I would in her place. For now, I'll wait. Watch. Gather what additional evidence I can without exposing myself. William's death will not be in vain. Rebecca closed the notebook, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage the simple action. The confirmation of her worst fears that William had been murdered to silence him collided with the revelation that Everett had deliberately kept this knowledge from her. He had made a unilateral decision to withhold information that should have been hers by right. The truth about William's death, the letter he had left for her, the arrangements he had made for their security. Everett Sullivan had appointed himself the arbiter of what Rebecca should know about her own husband's fate. The betrayal cut deep, all the more painful because she had begun to trust him, to see him as a potential ally in her struggle to build a new life for Matthew and herself. She had even entertained fleeting thoughts of a deeper connection drawn to his quiet strength and evident devotion to his daughter. Now she saw those qualities in a harsher light. His protectiveness extended only to those he considered his responsibility, Clara Emily, his ranch. Rebecca and Matthew, despite William's clear wishes, had been deemed expendable, left to struggle alone, while Everett kept the truth buried beneath his barn floor. The sound of childish voices approaching the barn snapped Rebecca back to the present moment. Hastily, she returned the letters and notebook to the satchel, replaced it in its hiding place, and pressed the floorboard back into position. She had just straightened up when Matthew and Emily appeared in the barn doorway, their baskets overflowing with green beans. "Mama," Matthew called, his face alight with pride at their harvest. "We picked all the beans just like you said, and Emily showed me how to tell which ones are ready and which ones need more time." Rebecca forced a smile, hoping the children couldn't see the turmoil in her eyes. "Well done, both of you. Those are perfect for preserving." She moved toward them, deliberately casual. "I was just checking if Charlie left the preserving kettle in here. He mentioned borrowing it for rendering tallow last week." If Emily sensed anything amiss in this explanation, she gave no sign of it. But as they walked back to the house together, the little girl slipped her hand into Rebecca's with unusual affection. "Papa's going to be sad when he comes home," she said matter-of-factly. "He doesn't like going to town when Miss Victoria might be there." Rebecca glanced down at the child, wondering anew at the extent of her perceptions. "Why would seeing Mrs. Hammond make your father sad, Emily?" Emily's face took on the distant expression that often preceded her most uncanny statements. "Because she wants things she can't have, and she tries to take them anyway." She looked up at Rebecca, her blue eyes suddenly sharp and present. "She wanted my mama's place, but she couldn't have it. Now she wants our land, and she can't have that either." The simple statement, delivered with a child's directness, revealed volumes about the complex dynamics at play in Silver Creek. Victoria Hammond had designs on Everett even during Clara's lifetime. Now she had aligned herself with the railroad interests seeking his land. And Everett, Rebecca realized, was caught in a dangerous game, refusing to sell land that powerful interests wanted, while simultaneously holding evidence that could damage those interests severely if made public. No wonder he kept a gun in his desk, as Emily had mentioned. The knowledge should have softened Rebecca's anger at his deception. Instead, it hardened her resolve. If the situation was as dangerous as it appeared, she and Matthew might be at risk, simply by association with the Sullivan household. She needed to confront Everett to demand the truth and the letter William had left for her. Only then could she decide whether to remain at the ranch or take Matthew and flee, seeking safety and anonymity as they had for the past year. As they entered the kitchen with their harvest, Rebecca's mind was already formulating the questions she would ask Everett upon his return. No more evasions, no more half-truths. She deserved to know exactly what connection had existed between her husband and Everett Sullivan, and why that connection had cost William his life. Whatever answer Everett gave would determine their future, whether the Sullivan Ranch would become the home Matthew so desperately needed, or merely another way station in their journey to find safety and stability in a world that had shown them little of either. The remainder of the day passed in a haze of domestic activity for Rebecca. Outwardly, she maintained a calm demeanor, helping the children prepare the green beans for preserving, teaching Matthew how to string them properly, while Emily chattered about the different varieties that grew in the garden. Inside, her thoughts churned with the revelations from William's letters and Everett's journal. Her husband had been murdered. The mining accident that had shattered her world had been deliberately orchestrated to silence Williams' investigation into the Northeastern Development Company's criminal negligence. And Everett Sullivan, the man who had offered her shelter and employment, who had shown such kindness to Matthew, had known the truth all along and chosen to keep it from her. By late afternoon, the kitchen was filled with the pungent smell of pickling, brine, and the sweet aroma of apple jelly bubbling on the stove. The children had long since abandoned the preserving project for the more appealing distraction of the kittens in the barn. Rebecca worked alone, finding a strange comfort in the familiar practical tasks that required just enough attention to keep her hands busy while her mind processed the morning's discoveries. The sound of a wagon approaching pulled her from her thoughts. Through the kitchen window, she saw Everett and Charlie returning from town, the wagon bed loaded with supplies. Emily and Matthew appeared from the direction of the barn, running to meet them with the boundless energy of childhood. Rebecca watched as Everett lifted Emily into his arms, his expression softening in that way it only did with his daughter. He said something that made both children laugh, then set Emily down and helped Matthew climb onto the wagon seat. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see her son's delight as Everett allowed him to hold the reins for the short distance to the barn. The sight created a painful knot in her chest. Matthew had been without a father's influence for too long. He had formed an attachment to Everett, looking to him for the male guidance Rebecca could not provide alone. How would he react when she confronted Everett with what she had learned? If the confrontation went poorly as she feared it might, would they once again be forced to leave a place where they had begun to feel at home? Rebecca turned back to her preservings, pushing these concerns aside for the moment. First, she needed to hear Everett's explanation. Then she would decide what was best for Matthew and herself. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. After the supplies had been unloaded and Charlie had departed for his own cabin, Everett appeared in the kitchen doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He removed his hat as he entered, a gesture of ingrained courtesy that seemed at odds with the deception Rebecca now knew he had practiced. "Something smells good," he commented, nodding toward the stove where the last batch of preserves simmered. "Mabel mentioned you might be putting up the garden produce today." Rebecca managed a neutral expression, though her heart had begun to race at his presence. The beans were ready, and there were enough windfall apples for a small batch of jelly. Matthew and Emily were quite helpful with the harvesting. Everett smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes that made Rebecca's task all the more difficult. Emily mentioned as much. "She's taken quite a shine to Matthew, says he listens better than most grown-ups." "Children often see things more clearly than adults," Rebecca replied, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. "They haven't yet learned to hide the truth or deceive others." Something in her tone must have alerted him. His expression shifted, the smile fading as he studied her face more closely. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Simmons? You seem troubled." Rebecca turned to face him fully, her decision made. "I found the photograph, Mr. Sullivan. The one of you and my husband at the mine entrance." The color drained from Everett's face, his expression freezing into a mask of carefully controlled shock. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes never leaving her face as he processed the implications of her statement. "I see," he said finally, his voice unnaturally even. "And having found it, what conclusions have you drawn?" His calm response ignited a spark of anger in Rebecca's chest. "I've drawn no conclusions. I've asked myself why a man who claimed to be a stranger would have a photograph of himself with my dead husband. Why he would offer employment to that man's widow without acknowledging their connection. Why he would keep the truth hidden even as he opened his home to us." Her voice remained steady, though it took considerable effort. "I'm not interested in conclusions, Mr. Sullivan. I want explanations." Everett's shoulders sagged slightly, as if a burden he had carried too long had suddenly doubled in weight. He glanced toward the open door, then back to Rebecca. "The children. In the barn with the kittens. They'll be occupied for some time." He nodded, seeming to come to a decision. "Not here. There are things you need to see, things I should have shown you from the beginning." He gestured toward the door. "Will you come to the house to my study?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded sharply. "Let me remove this last batch from the stove first. I wouldn't want to risk a fire in your absence." She completed the task with deliberate care, buying herself a moment to compose her thoughts. When she was done, she untied her apron and hung it precisely on its hook, a small act of control in a situation that threatened to overwhelm her. "I'm ready," she said, meeting Everett's gaze directly. They walked in silence to the main house, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. Inside the house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the front hall. Everett led her to a study, a book-lined room at the back of the house that Rebecca had glimpsed only in passing during her household duties. It was a masculine space furnished simply but comfortably, with a large oak desk, several leather chairs, and bookshelves that reached to the ceiling. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, though it stood cold and empty in the summer heat. The room smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and leather, a scent that unexpectedly reminded Rebecca of her father's study in her childhood home. Everett closed the door behind them, then moved to the desk. From the bottom drawer, he withdrew a small key which he used to unlock a cabinet built into the wall beside the fireplace. The door swung open to reveal a small safe. "William helped me install this when he visited 3 years ago," Everett said as he worked the combination. "He said every man with something to protect needed a good safe." A ghost of a smile touched his lips at the memory, then vanished as he swung the safe door open. From inside, he removed a thick envelope and a smaller sealed packet. He placed both on the desk, then turned to face Rebecca, his expression grave. "You're right to be angry," he said quietly. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I feared," he broke off, shaking his head. "No, that's not entirely honest. I told myself I was protecting you and Matthew by keeping you ignorant, but perhaps I was really protecting myself from having to face William's widow and explain why I lived while he died." The raw honesty in his voice took Rebecca aback. She had expected denials, perhaps, or carefully constructed explanations, not this straightforward admission of guilt. "You knew who I was at the train station," she said. It wasn't a question. Everett nodded. "Yes, William had described you often enough that I recognized you immediately. And Matthew," his voice softened, "he has his father's eyes." "Why the deception? Why not simply tell me who you were?" Everett gestured to the chairs by the fireplace. "Please sit. This is a long story and not an easy one to tell." Rebecca hesitated, then took the offered seat, her spine rigid with tension. Everett remained standing as if too restless to be confined. "William and I met 15 years ago working for the Northeastern Development Company's mining division." He began, his gaze directed at some middle distance as he recalled the past. "I was a surveyor fresh out of school. William had already been with the company for several years as a safety engineer. We became friends, almost immediately shared the same concerns about the company's practices, the same commitment to doing things properly." He paced a few steps, collecting his thoughts. "Over time, we began to notice patterns. Safety inspections that were announced days in advance, allowing time for temporary corrections. Reports that were altered after submission, accidents that could have been prevented with proper equipment or training." Rebecca nodded, remembering William's frustrated comments about company policies that valued profit over safety. He had never shared specifics, protecting her from knowledge that might worry her, but his concerns had been clear enough. "We started gathering evidence," Everett continued, "quietly at first, just documenting what we saw. But as we accumulated more proof of systematic negligence, we realized we were uncovering something bigger than isolated incidents. The Northeastern Development Company was deliberately, consistently cutting corners on safety to maximize profits across all its operations, mining, railroads, timber harvesting." He paused, meeting Rebecca's eyes directly. William was the brave one. He insisted we take what we'd found to the territorial authorities. I was more cautious, perhaps too cautious. I had met Clara by then, was considering marriage. I argued for building an airtight case before going public. "And did you build that case?" Rebecca prompted when he fell silent. Everett's expression darkened. "We tried. For years we gathered documents, collected testimonies from workers, tracked accidents back to specific safety violations. William continued even after you were married, after Matthew was born. He was determined to hold the company accountable." Rebecca felt a surge of pride in her husband's persistence, followed immediately by a stab of pain. That same determination had ultimately cost him his life. "What happened?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer from the documents she had found. Everett moved to the window, staring out at the lengthening shadows across the yard. "We got careless, or perhaps they got suspicious. William was caught copying company records, safety reports that had been falsified to hide dangerous conditions at the Silver Peak mine." His voice tightened. 2 weeks later, there was an accident. A support beam failed. William and 3 other men were killed. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly against the surge of grief that still came whenever she thought of that day, the company representative at her door, hat in hand, delivering the news that had shattered her world. "It wasn't an accident," she said, opening her eyes to fix Everett with a steady gaze. "It was murder." "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. "The support beam didn't fail. It was deliberately weakened. I can't prove it beyond doubt. The company made sure the evidence was buried with the victims, but I know it as surely as I know my own name." "And you never told me." Rebecca couldn't keep the accusation from her voice. "You let me believe the company's story, let me accept their paltry compensation as if William's death were nothing more than an unfortunate workplace incident." Everett turned from the window, his expression pained. "I tried to find you after the funeral. You had already left Colorado and no one seemed to know where you'd gone. The company claimed they had no forwarding address for William's widow." He raked a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "I searched for months, wrote to contacts in 3 states. By the time I learned you had relatives in Missouri, you had moved on from there as well." Rebecca remembered those desperate months after William's death, selling their home and most of their possessions to pay debts, moving first to her cousin's farm in Missouri, then on to a series of increasingly marginal accommodations as their funds dwindled. They had left no forwarding addresses, partly from necessity and partly from her desire to outrun the grief that seemed to follow them like a shadow. "And when you saw me at the train station," she pressed, "why not tell me then?" Everett's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Fear," he admitted finally. "Not for myself, but for you and Matthew. The company has a long reach, and they've never stopped watching me, suspecting I have evidence that could damage them. If they knew William's widow had appeared in Silver Creek, had made contact with me." He shook his head. "I thought I was protecting you by maintaining the pretense that we were strangers." It was a reasonable explanation consistent with the caution evident in his journal entries. Yet Rebecca sensed there was more he wasn't saying. "What about the letter?" she asked. "William's letter that you mentioned in your journal, the one containing arrangements for Matthew and me if anything happened to him." Surprise flickered across Everett's face. "You found my journal as well?" When she nodded, he sighed heavily. "You've been thorough in your investigations, Mrs. Simmons." "I had to know the truth," she said simply. "For Matthew's sake, if not my own." Everett nodded, accepting the justice of her actions. He moved to the desk and picked up the sealed packet he had removed from the safe. "This is William's letter," he said, holding it out to her. "I should have given it to you immediately, whatever the risk. I have no excuse except that I convinced myself you were safer in ignorance." Rebecca took the packet with trembling fingers. Her name was written on the front in William's bold, familiar handwriting. The sight of it sent a jolt of pain through her chest, a tangible reminder of all she had lost. "There's more," Everett said, indicating the larger envelope still on the desk. "Documents William entrusted to me before his death, evidence of the company's negligence, copies of falsified safety reports, witness statements. Enough to bring charges against the company executives if presented to an honest prosecutor." Rebecca looked up sharply. "Have you tried to bring charges?" Everett's expression hardened. "Twice. The first time the territorial prosecutor declined to pursue the case, citing insufficient evidence. 6 months later, he purchased a substantial property outside Denver that a man on his salary should never have been able to afford." "He was bribed," Rebecca surmised. "Almost certainly." The second attempt was more promising. A federal prosecutor agreed to review the evidence, seemed genuinely outraged by what he saw. 2 days before he was to present the case to a grand jury, his daughter was nearly killed in a runaway carriage incident in Washington. He recused himself from the case the following day, citing personal reasons. The calculated cruelty of such tactics left Rebecca momentarily speechless. She had known in an abstract way that powerful interests could influence justice. But to deliberately target a child to silence a prosecutor, it was a level of ruthlessness she had not imagined. "So you gave up," she said finally, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. Everett's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with sudden anger. "I did not give up," he said, each word clipped and precise. "I changed tactics. When direct confrontation failed, I began gathering evidence of the company's more recent activities, particularly their methods of acquiring land for railroad expansion." Understanding dawned. "The North Pasture dispute." "Exactly." Everett's voice took on an edge of grim satisfaction. The company wants that land for a spur line to new mining operations in the mountains. The route through my property is the most direct, would save them considerable money and construction costs. When I refused to sell, they produced a survey showing the land was actually within their existing right-of-way. A falsified survey, Rebecca guessed, remembering Williams' letter about the company's tactics. Precisely. The same playbook they've used elsewhere: create paper trails, manipulate surveys, pressure landowners. He quoted Williams' words exactly, confirming that he had read and reread those letters many times. I've been gathering evidence of their methods, building a case that connects their current activities to the past safety violations. A pattern of criminal behavior that spans years and crosses state lines. Rebecca absorbed this information, seeing Everett's actions in a new light. His refusal to sell the North Pasture wasn't simple stubbornness or attachment to family land, though those elements were present. It was part of a longer game, a strategic effort to expose the company's corrupt practices and finally bring them to justice for Williams' death. Victoria Hammond, she said, making another connection. She's working with them. Everett's mouth tightened. Victoria has always valued money and position above all else. When her husband died, she found herself with substantial property but limited liquid assets. The railroad offered her a generous commission for any land she could help them acquire. She's been their willing agent ever since, using her position in the community to pressure holdouts like myself. And her visit yesterday? A warning thinly veiled. The company is losing patience with my refusal to sell. They're preparing to escalate matters. His expression was grim. Victoria suggested that accidents can happen on isolated ranches: fires, stampedes, falls from horses, particularly to young children. Rebecca's blood ran cold at the implied threat to Emily. That's why you keep a gun in your desk now. If Everett was surprised by her knowledge of this detail, he didn't show it. Yes, I've never been one for firearms, but circumstances change when your child is threatened. He paused, studying her face. Now perhaps you understand why I was reluctant to acknowledge our connection publicly. The company already has reason to target me. If they knew William Simmons's widow and son were under my protection— He didn't need to finish the thought. Rebecca understood with painful clarity the danger her presence might bring to the Sullivan household, and the danger Matthew might face simply by association with Everett. She looked down at the sealed letter in her hands, William's last communication to her. Whatever it contained, arrangements for their financial security, evidence against the company, a final expression of love. It had been important enough for him to entrust to his closest friend with specific instructions for its delivery. I need time, she said quietly, to read this, to think about what you've told me. Everett nodded, making no move to stop her as she rose from her chair. Of course, take all the time you need. He hesitated, then added, whatever you decide whether to stay or go, I'll help you in any way I can. I owe William that much. I owe you that much. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but Rebecca was in no state to evaluate it objectively. Her mind was too full of new information, her emotions too raw from reopened grief. Thank you for your honesty, she said formally, clutching William's letter like a lifeline. If you'll excuse me, I should check on the children. She left the study with as much dignity as she could muster, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. The magnitude of what she had learned, not just about William's death, but about the ongoing dangers surrounding the Sullivan Ranch, threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the prairie in hues of gold and amber. Rebecca paused on the porch, drawing deep breaths of the cool evening air to steady herself. In the distance, she could see Matthew and Emily still playing near the barn, their small figures silhouetted against the deepening twilight. They looked so vulnerable from this distance, so innocent of the dark currents swirling around them. Matthew had already lost his father to the company's ruthlessness. Now he faced potential danger simply because Rebecca had brought him to Silver Creek, to the one place where William's killers might connect him to their ongoing crimes. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her like a physical burden. She had to make the right decision, not just for herself, but for Matthew, whose safety and happiness were her primary concern. And now, knowing what she did about the threats against Emily, she couldn't ignore the potential consequences her presence might have for the Sullivan household as well. With trembling fingers, Rebecca broke the seal on William's letter, unfolding the pages to reveal her husband's familiar handwriting. The date at the top, December 18th, 1881, just 4 months before his death, sent a fresh wave of grief through her. He had written this in anticipation of danger, knowing the risk he was taking by continuing his investigation. My dearest Rebecca, if you are reading these words, then my fears have been realized, and I am no longer with you and our beloved Matthew. I pray that Everett has found you quickly and that you are now safe under his protection at the Sullivan Ranch in Montana Territory. First and foremost, I must beg your forgiveness for the secrets I have kept from you. I convinced myself that ignorance would keep you safe, that by shielding you from knowledge of my investigation into the Northeastern Development Company's criminal practices, I was protecting you and Matthew from potential harm. I see now that this reasoning, however well-intentioned, was flawed. You deserve the truth, and my failure to share it with you may have left you vulnerable in ways I never intended. The full details of my work with Everett are contained in the documents I've entrusted to his keeping. In brief, for nearly 10 years, we have been gathering evidence of systematic safety violations, bribery of officials, falsification of records, and other criminal acts committed by the Northeastern Development Company and its subsidiaries across multiple territories. What began as a concern over unsafe mining practices expanded as we discovered the same ruthless disregard for law and human life in all the company's operations. If I have died before our work was completed, it was almost certainly at the company's hand. They do not hesitate to eliminate those they consider threats to their operations, and my recent activities may have drawn their attention. I accepted this risk knowingly, believing that exposing their crimes and preventing future deaths was worth the danger to myself. I could not, however, accept any risk to you and Matthew. To that end, I have made certain arrangements for your security and support should anything happen to me. First, I have deposited the sum of $5,000 with the First National Bank of Denver in a special account under Everett's management. This money comes from my grandfather's legacy, which I kept separate from our regular finances as a safeguard. Everett has instructions to transfer these funds to you as soon as he locates you. Second, I have purchased in Matthew's name a small property adjacent to the Sullivan Ranch, 120 acres of good grazing land with a modest house and barn. The deed is held in trust by Everett until Matthew reaches his majority, with provision for you to occupy and manage the property in the meantime. It is my hope that you will make this your home, close to the Sullivans, who can offer protection and friendship in my absence. Finally, I have written letters to 3 reputable newspapers and 2 federal prosecutors to be mailed by Everett in the event of my untimely death under suspicious circumstances. These letters outline our findings regarding the Northeastern Development Company and name the executives we believe responsible for the criminal decisions that have cost so many lives. While these letters alone may not bring the company to justice, they will ensure that my death does not go unmarked or my work unfinished. My beloved Rebecca, I know the burden I have placed upon you is immense and unfair. To be left alone to raise our son, possibly to face danger from powerful enemies, it is more than any husband should ask of his wife. If I could have found another way to fulfill my obligations to the men who have died due to the company's negligence while still protecting you and Matthew completely, I would have taken it without hesitation. I can only hope that you will find it in your heart to understand, if not to forgive, the choices I have made. And I hope that you will allow Everett to help you as he has promised he will. He is the best of men, steadfast and honorable to his core. Clara, too, is a treasure, a woman of remarkable perception and kindness. They will be good friends to you and Matthew in the difficult days ahead. Tell our son about me when he is old enough to understand. Tell him I loved him more than life itself, and that if I have died in pursuit of justice, it was so that he might grow up in a world where powerful men cannot kill with impunity for the sake of profit. And know, my dearest heart, that my love for you transcends even death. You have been the light of my life, the joy in every day, the home to which I always returned with gladness. Whatever comes, carry that knowledge with you always, yours in this life and beyond. William. Rebecca folded the letter with unsteady hands, tears streaming unchecked down her face. William's words, his love, his regret, his careful planning, even in the face of mortal danger, broke through the protective numbness she had cultivated since his death. For the first time in over a year, she allowed herself to feel the full measure of her loss, to grieve, not just for the husband taken from her, but for the future they had planned together. She wept silently on the porch as the sun slipped below the horizon, the vast Montana sky darkening from gold to deepest blue. Stars appeared one by one, pinpricks of light in the gathering darkness, steady and unchanging as they had been since the beginning of time. When her tears were finally spent, Rebecca felt oddly lightened, as if a burden she had carried too long had been partially lifted. William had not abandoned them through recklessness or misplaced idealism. He had made careful, thoughtful provisions for their security, had weighed the risks of his actions against his moral obligations, and had entrusted them to people he believed would protect them. And he had been right about Everett Sullivan. Whatever mistakes the man had made in concealing their connection, his actions since their arrival at the ranch had demonstrated exactly the steadfast honor William had described. He had opened his home to them, had shown kindness to Matthew, had begun to heal the wounds left by a year of struggle and uncertainty. The question now was whether Rebecca could trust Everett's assessment of the danger they faced. If the Northeastern Development Company was truly as ruthless as both men believed, if they were willing to threaten a child to silence opposition, then her presence at the Sullivan Ranch might be placing Matthew in greater danger rather than less. Yet the alternative to leave to continue their nomadic existence, moving from town to town in search of temporary work and shelter, offered no real security either. Sooner or later, resources would run out. Matthew needed stability, education, a place to put down roots. And William had wanted that place to be here near the Sullivans, on land he had purchased specifically for their future. Rebecca's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of children's laughter. Looking up, she saw Matthew and Emily racing across the yard toward the house, their small figures dark against the twilight landscape. Behind them came Everett, walking more slowly, his tall frame unmistakable even in the gathering darkness. Watching them approach her, son Everett's daughter and the man himself, Rebecca was struck by how much they already resembled a family unit. Matthew had blossomed in the weeks since their arrival, regaining the confidence and curiosity that grief and instability had dampened. Emily, too, seemed to have formed a genuine attachment to both Matthew and Rebecca, finding in them the expanded family her isolated existence had lacked. In Everett, Rebecca couldn't deny the connection that had begun to form between them, built on shared responsibility for their children and mutual respect for their respective capabilities. There had been moments watching the sunset together, working side by side in comfortable silence, exchanging glances of shared understanding when the children said something particularly endearing or absurd, when she had glimpsed the possibility of something deeper developing. Now, knowing the full truth of his connection to William, that possibility seemed both more complicated and more tangible. Everett had been William's closest friend, had shared his moral outrage at the company's criminal acts, had continued their work even after William's death. There was a foundation there, a shared history and set of values that couldn't be discounted. The children reached the porch steps, breathless with exertion and excitement. "Mama," Matthew called, his face flushed with happiness. "Emily showed me how to make Domino stand up on his hind legs. He's the smartest kitten in the litter." Rebecca managed a smile, quickly wiping away the last traces of tears from her cheeks. "That sounds wonderful. Sweet pea, it must be nearly supper time. Why don't you both wash your hands while I see what we can prepare?" Matthew nodded eagerly, but Emily's gaze lingered on Rebecca's face, her unusual perceptiveness apparently detecting signs of her emotional state. "You're sad," she observed with a child's directness. "Did Papa show you the special papers?" Rebecca exchanged a quick glance with Everett, who had just reached the porch. His expression was apologetic but not surprised by his daughter's insight. "Yes, Emily," Rebecca answered carefully. "Your father showed me some important papers that belonged to my husband, Matthew's father." Emily nodded as if this confirmed something she had already known. "That's why you came here, so Papa could give you the papers and tell you about the bad men." She spoke with absolute certainty, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Had Emily somehow known, even before they met at the train station, who they were and why they had come to Silver Creek? It seemed impossible, yet the child's uncanny perceptions had been demonstrated too many times to dismiss entirely. "Emily," Everett said gently, "why don't you show Matthew where the wash basin is in the kitchen? Mrs. Simmons and I need to speak privately for a moment." The little girl nodded, taking Matthew's hand with casual affection. "Come on, I'll show you how to use the soap that smells like lemons. It's my favorite." When the children had disappeared inside, Everett turned to Rebecca, his expression grave in the deepening twilight. I assume from your reaction that William's letter contained significant information. Rebecca nodded, still clutching the folded pages. He made arrangements I knew nothing about money in a Denver bank land purchased for Matthew. She looked up at Everett, a new question forming. The property he mentioned adjacent to your ranch, is it real? Very real, Everett confirmed. 120 acres of good grassland with a small but sound house. Old man Guthrie's place. William bought it when Guthrie decided to return east after his wife died. He hesitated, then added, I've maintained it as best I could, kept the roof repaired in the worst of the prairie from reclaiming the yard. It's habitable if basic. Rebecca tried to absorb this new information that William had purchased land specifically for them, that they weren't as destitute as she had believed for the past year. If she had known about the Denver account about the property, their struggle for survival would have been considerably less desperate. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, the question encompassing not just the property, but all the secrets Everett had kept. He leaned against the porch railing, his face half in shadow. Fear at first. When I couldn't find you immediately after William's death, I became convinced the company might be searching for you as well. Might be monitoring correspondence or bank activity in your name. I was afraid that claiming the property or accessing the account might lead them to you. It was a reasonable concern consistent with the caution both men had shown in their investigation, but it didn't explain his silence after their arrival at the ranch. And later, she pressed, after we arrived here, Everett was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing his words carefully. Shame, he said finally. The longer I delayed telling you the truth, the more difficult it became to admit my deception. And perhaps, he hesitated, then continued in a lower voice, perhaps I wanted you to stay because you chose to, not because William had arranged it. The admission hung in the air between them, its implications too complex to address in the moment. Rebecca looked away, her gaze drawn to the first evening star appearing in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. I need time, she said finally, to think about all of this, to decide what's best for Matthew and myself. Of course. Everett straightened his tone, becoming more formal as he retreated from the vulnerability of his admission. Whatever you decide, the property is Matthew's by right. William's letter to me was explicit on that point. And the money in Denver is yours to claim whenever you wish. I can make the arrangements without you having to travel there yourself. Rebecca nodded, grateful for his practicality, even as her mind struggled with the emotional complexities of their situation. Thank you. For now, I think it's best if we continue as we have been, at least outwardly. For the children's sake, if nothing else. Agreed. Everett seemed relieved by her pragmatic approach. Which reminds me, Mabel mentioned the church service and picnic on Sunday. It might be wise for us all to attend to avoid drawing attention with any change in routine. The thought of facing the scrutiny of the entire Silver Creek community, including Victoria Hammond, and whatever railroad representatives might be present, made Rebecca's stomach tighten with anxiety. Yet she recognized the wisdom in maintaining appearances, in not signaling to potential enemies that anything had changed. We'll be ready, she assured him. Matthew has suitable clothes and I have my blue dress. The same dress Emily had mentioned on their first day at the ranch, demonstrating her inexplicable knowledge of things she couldn't possibly have seen. Everett nodded, apparently satisfied with her cooperation. I should help the children with washing up. They're likely making more of a mess than getting clean if left to their own devices. He turned to go, then paused, looking back at her with an expression that combined regret and resolve. I am sorry, Rebecca, for not telling you the truth from the beginning. For thinking I had the right to decide what you should know about your own husband's death. The use of her given name the first time he had addressed her so informally underscored the sincerity of his apology. I understand why you did it, she said after a moment. I might have made the same choice in your position, trying to protect Emily. But understanding isn't the same as forgiveness. No, he agreed quietly. That has to be earned, not granted. If you'll allow me the opportunity, I'll do my best to earn it. With that, he entered the house, leaving Rebecca alone on the porch with the gathering night and her turbulent thoughts. She remained there long after the children had been fed and put to bed, after the lights in the main house had dimmed and silence had settled over the ranch. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, the same stars William had gazed upon during his visits to this place, the same stars that had witnessed his death and her subsequent struggle. What would he want her to do now? The letter made his wishes clear enough that she and Matthew should make their home near the Sullivans, should accept Everett's protection and friendship. But William had written those instructions without knowing that Everett would conceal their connection for over a year, would allow her to struggle in ignorance of the resources he had provided for her security. Yet hadn't she herself kept secrets from Matthew, thinking to protect him from knowledge that might cause him pain? Wasn't that the same impulse that had driven Everett's deception? The desire to shield those we love from harsh truths was powerful even when misguided. And there was Emily to consider, a child with uncanny gifts that isolated her from her peers, a child who had formed an immediate and powerful bond with Matthew. Could Rebecca separate them now, knowing how few friends either child had? Could she deny Matthew the stability and happiness he had found at the Sullivan Ranch, simply because Everett had made the mistake of trying to protect them in the wrong way? The questions circled in her mind without clear answers. Only one thing seemed certain: whatever decision she made would irrevocably shape their future for good or ill. As the night deepened around her, Rebecca finally rose from her seat on the porch steps, her limbs stiff from long immobility. She entered the cabin quietly, careful not to wake Matthew, who slept soundly in his trundle bed, one arm curved protectively around his small wooden horse, a gift from Everett on their third day at the ranch. The sight of her son sleeping peacefully, secure in the belief that tomorrow would bring another day of exploration and discovery at the Sullivan Ranch, crystallized something in Rebecca's mind. Whatever her personal feelings about Everett's deception, Matthew's well-being had to come first. And here, for the first time since William's death, he was thriving. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice and more like a recognition of what had already begun to take shape since their arrival at the ranch. They would stay not just as temporary employees, but as neighbors claiming the property William had purchased for them. They would face whatever danger the Northeastern Development Company might represent, together with the Sullivans, united by shared loss and common purpose. And if in time the connection forming between Rebecca and Everett developed into something deeper, they would address that possibility honestly, acknowledging both the shadow of William's death and the potential for a new beginning. With that resolution reached, Rebecca prepared for bed, her mind clearer than it had been in months. Tomorrow would bring challenges, practical arrangements for claiming William's property, continued vigilance against the company's threats, the public scrutiny of the church service and picnic. But for tonight, she would rest secure in the knowledge that she had made the best decision possible for Matthew's future and her own. Outside, a coyote called into the darkness, its voice rising in a series of yips that climbed to a haunting howl. From far across the prairie came an answering call, another lone hunter acknowledging that even in the vastness of the Montana night, no creature was truly alone. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the late summer sky a flawless blue vault overhead. Rebecca woke early, a knot of anticipation in her stomach at the prospect of the day ahead. The church service and community picnic would be her first public appearance in Silver Creek. Beyond the train station, her formal introduction to the society that might soon be her permanent community. She dressed with particular care, donning the blue dress that had been William's favorite. It was slightly faded from many washings, and the lace at the collar had been carefully mended, but the cut was flattering and the color brought out the blue in her eyes. Her hair, usually confined in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, she arranged in a more becoming style, allowing a few soft curls to frame her face. Matthew, too, was dressed in his best, the single good suit he had owned when William died, now almost too small after a year of growth. Rebecca had let down the cuffs and hems as much as possible, but it was clear he would need new clothes soon. Another expense to consider, another reminder of the practical challenges that remained despite William's provisions. They walked to the main house together, Matthew unusually subdued in his formal attire. Emily was waiting for them on the porch, a vision in white organdy with a blue sash that complemented Rebecca's dress. Her wheat blonde hair had been arranged in neat ringlets, tied back with matching ribbon. "You look very pretty, Mrs. Simmons," she said with their characteristic directness. "Like a real lady, not just a housekeeper." Rebecca smiled despite herself. "Thank you, Emily. You look lovely as well." Everett emerged from the house then, and Rebecca's breath caught involuntarily at the transformation. Gone was the practical rancher in work clothes and dusty boots. In his place stood a gentleman in a well-cut dark suit, crisp white shirt, and carefully knotted tie. His hair, usually somewhat unruly, had been tamed with pomade, and he had trimmed his beard to a neat precision that accentuated the strong line of his jaw. He stopped short at the sight of her, something flickering in his eyes that might have been appreciation, or might have been memory, perhaps of another woman in a blue dress standing on this same porch in years past. "Mrs. Simmons," he greeted her formally, though his gaze lingered a moment longer than strictly proper. "You and Matthew look very fine this morning." "As do you and Emily," she replied, matching his formality while acknowledging the unspoken current between them. After their conversation on the porch, after her night of reflection and decision-making, something had shifted in their relationship, a tentative step toward honesty, if not yet forgiveness. "The wagon is ready," Everett said, offering his hand to assist her up the porch steps. "Charlie and Mabel will meet us at the church. They left earlier to help with preparations for the picnic." The journey to Silver Creek passed in relative silence, each adult lost in private thoughts, while the children whispered together in the back of the wagon. The prairie was at its summer peak, wildflowers dotting the grassland in splashes of purple, yellow, and white. In the distance, the mountains rose in hazy silhouette against the brilliant sky, eternal sentinels watching over the human dramas playing out in their shadow. As they approached the town, Rebecca felt her anxiety return. The small church, perched on a low hill at the edge of Silver Creek, was already surrounded by wagons and buggies, indicating a substantial turnout for the circuit preacher's visit. Families in their Sunday best moved toward the white clapboard building, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of a close-knit community. Everett found a place for their wagon near the hitching post, then assisted Rebecca and the children down with careful courtesy. As they walked toward the church, Rebecca was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way, the whispered comments that followed their progress. "That's the new housekeeper at Sullivan's place. Widow with a young boy, I heard. Came in on the train day of the robbery. Sullivan seems mighty taken with her already." The last comment, delivered in a knowing tone by a woman in an over-trimmed hat, brought a flush to Rebecca's cheeks. Everett, walking beside her, must have heard it too, for his expression tightened momentarily before smoothing into careful neutrality. They had nearly reached the church steps when Victoria Hammond emerged from a group of well-dressed townspeople. Her burgundy Sunday dress, a dramatic contrast to the more modest attire of most Silver Creek women. She intercepted them with practiced grace, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Everett, how delightful to see you," she greeted him, deliberately ignoring Rebecca and the children. "I was beginning to think you'd become a complete recluse out at that ranch of yours." "Victoria," Everett's acknowledgement was polite but cool. "You remember Mrs. Simmons and her son Matthew. And Emily, of course." Victoria's gaze swept over Rebecca with barely concealed assessment. "Indeed, your new housekeeper. How kind of you to include her in family activities." The slight emphasis on housekeeper carried clear implications about Rebecca's status and place. Before Rebecca could respond, Emily spoke up with her usual forthrightness. "Mrs. Simmons isn't just our housekeeper. She's Matthew's mama, and Matthew's papa was Papa's best friend. That makes them family." She delivered this pronouncement with absolute certainty, unaware of the bombshell she had just dropped into the conversation. A ripple of whispers spread from those close enough to overhear. Victoria's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline, her practiced composure momentarily shaken. "Is that so?" She recovered quickly, her tone sharp with interest. "How fascinating. I wasn't aware you had any connection to Mrs. Simmons before she arrived in Silver Creek, Everett." Everett's expression remained impassive, though Rebecca could sense the tension radiating from him. He had placed a protective hand on Emily's shoulder, perhaps to prevent further revelations. "William Simmons and I worked together many years ago," he said calmly, offering no further explanation. "If you'll excuse us, Victoria, the service is about to begin." He guided their small group past her and up the church steps, maintaining his composure, despite the curious stares now directed openly at them. Rebecca followed his lead, her spine straight and her head high despite the churning anxiety in her stomach. Emily's innocent disclosure had just announced to the entire community, including Victoria Hammond, who was almost certainly reporting to the railroad interests, that Rebecca was not simply a housekeeper, but the widow of Everett's best friend. How long would it take for that information to reach the Northeastern Development Company? And what might they do when they realized William Simmons's widow had appeared in Silver Creek in close association with the man who held evidence of their crimes? As they took their seats in a pew near the back of the church, Rebecca leaned close to Everett under the pretext of arranging her skirts. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I should have prepared Emily better explained what could and couldn't be said publicly." Everett shook his head slightly, his voice equally low. The fault is mine. I should have been honest from the beginning with everyone. Secrets have a way of revealing themselves at the most inopportune moments. His wry acceptance of the situation eased Rebecca's concern somewhat. Still, as the congregation rose for the opening hymn, she couldn't help scanning the faces turned toward the front of the church, wondering which might be reporting their every move to the company, which might represent a threat to their safety. The service itself passed in a blur for Rebecca, her attention divided between maintaining appropriate responses to the preacher's enthusiastic sermon and monitoring the reactions of those around them. Victoria Hammond sat across the aisle and several rows ahead, her elegant profile visible whenever she turned to speak to the distinguished-looking gentleman beside her, a stranger to Rebecca, but clearly someone of importance based on his expensive attire and the deference shown to him by others. When the final prayer had been said and the congregation began to file out toward the picnic grounds behind the church, Mabel Baker made her way to their pew, her round face creased with concern. "That child of yours," she whispered to Everett, shaking her head, "got her mama's gift for seeing truth and none of her discretion about sharing it." She glanced at Rebecca apologetically. "Word's already spreading through the congregation about your connection to the Sullivans. Victoria's making sure of that." Everett's expression hardened. "Let her talk. There's nothing improper in offering employment and shelter to the widow of an old friend." "No, but there might be danger in it," Mabel countered, lowering her voice further, "especially given who Victoria's been keeping company with this morning." "I noticed her companion." Everett said, his tone neutral, though his eyes had sharpened with interest. "New in town?" Mabel nodded, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Theodore Blake, senior representative for the Northeastern Development Company's Railroad Division. Arrived on yesterday's train, took the best suite at Victoria's hotel." She gave Rebecca a significant look. "Timing seems mighty convenient, doesn't it?" Rebecca felt a chill despite the warmth of the crowded church. Blake. The name was familiar from the documents she had seen in Everett's study, one of the company executives William had identified as responsible for the criminal decisions that had cost miners' lives. "We should leave," she said quietly, instinctively moving closer to Matthew, who was chatting happily with Emily, oblivious to the adults' concerns. "Return to the ranch before we draw more attention." Everett shook his head slightly. "That would only confirm any suspicions Blake might have. We need to appear completely at ease, unconcerned by his presence." He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll attend the picnic as planned, make appropriate conversation, then leave at a reasonable hour like any other family enjoying a Sunday outing." Family. The word hung in the air between them both, a pretense for public consumption and a reflection of the reality taking shape around them, a unit formed not by blood or marriage, but by shared purpose and mutual protection. "Everett's right," Mabel agreed reluctantly. "Running now would only make you look guilty of something. Better to brazen it out, show there's nothing to hide." She patted Rebecca's arm reassuringly. "Charlie and I will stay close. Safety in numbers." As they made their way out of the church and toward the picnic grounds, Rebecca kept Matthew's hand firmly in hers, her senses heightened to every glance, every whispered comment. Emily skipped alongside them, apparently untroubled by the stir her revelation had caused, secure in the rightness of her declaration that the Simmonses were family. The picnic grounds had been set up in a small meadow behind the church where trestle tables groaned under the weight of potluck offerings brought by the congregation. Children darted between groups of conversing adults, their Sunday best already showing signs of exuberant play. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a pleasant scene of community fellowship. But these were not normal circumstances. As they approached the tables, Rebecca was acutely aware of Victoria Hammond and Theodore Blake, observing their progress from a spot beneath a large oak tree. Victoria's expression was one of calculated interest, but Blake's face showed something harder, more evaluative, the look of a man assessing potential threats to his interests. Everett guided them to a table somewhat removed from the main gathering, where Charlie Baker had already claimed space for their group. "Best to give folks time to satisfy their curiosity from a distance," he murmured to Rebecca as he held a chair for her. "The initial excitement will die down once they find some new topic of gossip." Rebecca nodded, though she doubted the interest in their connection would fade so quickly, especially with Victoria Hammond fanning the flames. She helped Matthew fill a plate with fried chicken potato salad and fresh bread, encouraging him to eat despite her own lack of appetite. They had just settled into their meal when a shadow fell across the table. Rebecca looked up to find Theodore Blake standing beside them, Victoria Hammond at his elbow. Blake was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, with silver threading his dark hair and cold calculation in his pale eyes. He wore his expensive suit with the ease of someone accustomed to the finest things in life, and his smile did not reach above his thin lips. "Mr. Sullivan," he greeted Everett with practiced cordiality. "Mrs. Hammond has been kind enough to introduce me to the leading citizens of Silver Creek, and you were mentioned as one of the area's most established ranchers." He extended his hand. "Theodore Blake Northeastern Development Company." Everett rose slowly, accepting the handshake with evident reluctance. "Mr. Blake, I believe we've met before, though it's been some years, during my time with the mining division in Colorado." Blake's smile remained fixed, though something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or wariness. "Indeed, I meet so many people in my position, I'm afraid I don't recall the specific occasion." "I'm not surprised," Everett replied, his tone deceptively mild. "It was a rather formal inquiry following a mine collapse. Several men died due to inadequate safety measures. I was one of the surveyors called to testify about the condition of the supports." The atmosphere at the table chilled perceptibly. Blake's smile tightened, becoming more grimace than expression of pleasure. "A tragic incident, I'm sure. The mining business has inherent dangers despite our best efforts at safety. Some dangers are more inherent than others." Everett observed, his gaze steady on Blake's face. Victoria intervened, clearly sensing the tension. "Mr. Blake is in Silver Creek to oversee the final surveys for the new spur line," she explained with forced brightness. "Such an opportunity for our little town, new jobs, increased commerce connections to larger markets. For those who stand to profit from it." Everett agreed, his emphasis making it clear who he thought those beneficiaries might be. Blake's attention shifted to Rebecca, his cold eyes assessing her with uncomfortable thoroughness. "And this must be your new housekeeper. Mrs. Simmons, I believe." His use of her name, which Victoria might have supplied, but which carried an undertone of prior knowledge, sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. "Yes," she answered simply, meeting his gaze with as much composure as she could muster. "My son Matthew and I are grateful for Mr. Sullivan's kindness in offering us employment and accommodation." "I understand you're recently widowed." Blake continued, his tone sympathetic, though his eyes remained calculating. "Such a difficult position for a young woman with a child to support." "Your husband's occupation was—" The direct question about William sent Rebecca's heart racing, but she maintained her outward calm. "A mining engineer," she replied, offering no further details. "Indeed, with which company, if I may ask?" Blake's persistence carried a predatory edge, like a cat toying with a cornered mouse. Before Rebecca could respond, Emily spoke up from her place beside Matthew. "His papa worked for the same company as Papa did," she announced confidently. "That's why they were friends. They both knew the company was doing bad things." A shocked silence fell over the table. Victoria's eyes widened at this unexpected revelation, while Blake's expression froze into a mask of rigid control. Everett placed a restraining hand on his daughter's shoulder, though the damage had already been done. "Children and their imaginations," he said with forced lightness. "Emily has been creating quite elaborate stories since her mother died. Her way of making sense of the world, I suppose." Blake recovered quickly, his smile now sharp as a blade. "Quite understandable. Children do say the most unexpected things." He turned back to Rebecca, his gaze more intent than ever. "Your husband's name, Mrs. Simmons. Perhaps I knew him during my time with the mining division." Rebecca felt the trap closing around them. To refuse to answer would confirm Blake's obvious suspicions. To lie might be easily disproven if he already knew the truth. To tell the truth would be to acknowledge the very connection they had been trying to conceal. "William Simmons," she said, finally choosing honesty as the least dangerous option. "He died in a cave-in at the Silver Peak mine last spring." Blake's eyes narrowed slightly at the confirmation. "Ah, yes, a tragic accident as I recall. The company provided for his widow and child, I believe, a generous settlement given the circumstances." The implied threat in his words, the reminder that the company knew exactly who she was and what had happened to William, was unmistakable. Rebecca felt a surge of protective fury replace her fear. This man, or men like him, had ordered William's death, had robbed Matthew of his father, had pursued their profit at the cost of countless lives. The company provided the bare minimum required by law, she replied, her voice steady despite the anger coursing through her. Hardly generous, Mr. Blake, but perhaps reflective of the company's overall approach to its responsibilities. A tense silence followed her bold statement. Everett moved subtly closer to her side while Charlie Baker straightened in his chair, his weathered hand moving toward the knife beside his plate. Blake's cold smile never wavered. You seem to have strong opinions about corporate responsibilities, Mrs. Simmons. Perhaps we might discuss them further during my stay in Silver Creek. He glanced at Everett, the threat in his eyes now undisguised. I expect to be in town for several days concluding our business regarding the northern grazing lands. I do hope we can reach a satisfactory arrangement, Mr. Sullivan. It would be unfortunate if further accidents were to occur in the area. With that parting shot, he offered a slight bow to the table at large, then turned and walked away, Victoria Hammond hurrying after him with a triumphant glance over her shoulder. That went well, Charlie muttered sarcastically once the pair was out of earshot. Might as well have painted a target on our backs. Everett's expression was grim. Blake knew exactly who Rebecca was before he approached our table. This was a warning, a demonstration that the company is aware of her presence in Silver Creek and her connection to me. Rebecca felt physically ill at the implications. Matthew, she whispered instinctively, reaching for her son, who was still focused on his dessert, blissfully unaware of the dangerous currents swirling around him. If they know about William, about us, we need to leave, Mabel said firmly, already beginning to gather their things. Not just the picnic, Silver Creek. All of you, tonight if possible. Blake wouldn't have shown his hand so openly unless he was confident in his position. Everett nodded, his decision apparently already made. Charlie, ride ahead to the ranch. Pack whatever can't be replaced documents from the safe, Emily's mother's things, essential supplies. We'll follow with the wagon as soon as we can leave without drawing more attention. Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude for his immediate, decisive action. There was no debate about whether she and Matthew would accompany them, no question of separating their fates now that the danger had been made explicit. Whatever complications existed in their personal relationship, Everett had committed to protecting them as William would have wanted. Where will we go? She asked, keeping her voice low as she helped Matthew gather his things, maintaining a calm facade for the children's sake. William's property first. Everett replied, his gaze scanning the picnic grounds where Blake and Victoria had rejoined the main group of townspeople. It's the last place they'd expect us to go, given that they don't know about the purchase. From there, wait, Imoyu, he hesitated, then continued with firm resolve. From there to Helena, where the federal prosecutor is based. It's time to bring this evidence to light, whatever the personal risk. Rebecca nodded, accepting his plan without argument. The confrontation with Blake had changed everything, transforming their nebulous concerns into immediate, tangible danger. They could no longer afford the luxury of half measures or extended deliberation. As they made their way toward their wagon with carefully maintained casualness, Rebecca felt Emily's small hand slip into hers. She looked down to find the child watching her with those unnervingly perceptive blue eyes. Don't be scared, Emily said quietly. Mama says we'll be all right if we stay together. She says the bad men can't hurt us if we remember we're stronger together than apart. The simple statement, delivered with absolute conviction, sent a shiver down Rebecca's spine. Had Emily truly heard her mother's voice, receive guidance from beyond the grave? Or was this another manifestation of the child's extraordinary intuition, her ability to sense what others needed to hear at crucial moments? Whatever the source, the message resonated with Rebecca's own instincts. They were stronger together, Everett, with his determination and knowledge of the company's methods, Rebecca with her fierce protectiveness and practical resilience, and the children with their uncomplicated faith in the adults who cared for them. Together they would face whatever dangers lay ahead. Together they would seek justice for William and all the others who had died at the company's hands. And together perhaps they would build the future William had envisioned for them, a legacy not of fear and loss, but of courage, truth, and family forged in adversity. As their wagon pulled away from the church grounds, Rebecca caught one last glimpse of Theodore Blake, watching their departure, his cold eyes calculating even at this distance. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the fear he sought to inspire. Then she turned her face forward toward the open prairie and the uncertain future that awaited them beyond the horizon. Whatever came next, danger, hardship, or eventual justice, They would face it not as isolated individuals, but as a family bound by choice and circumstance. And in that unity lay their greatest strength, their most powerful weapon against those who would threaten what they held dear. The legacy William had left them was not just land or money, but the connections he had forged in life, connections that now offered Rebecca and Matthew the hope of a new beginning, a true home, and the justice that had been too long denied.